Hello and welcome to question and answer number 78. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I apologize for skipping last weekend, but I was relatively sick at the time. I'm pretty much kind of improved now, but still I may cough a little bit or blow my nose on this here particular toilet paper in the midst of this Q&A, which is going to be a long one probably. And it's weird. Whatever I got, it's just, I get the feeling that it must have escaped from some kind of biolab, because it's like some kind of strain of something like a cold that I have practically no resistance to. So I've been under the weather for more than a week now, with like stuff in my lungs and stuff in my head, and it's just not pretty. But the show must go on, even though it didn't go on last weekend. So we got lots of questions because we got a 2-week supply of them this time. We're getting up around 50 questions this time, which is manageable. I've done it before, but it may be a long one. And also, before I start answering questions, there are a few issues that I need to address. One is that in the previous Q&A, I said that my sweetheart's mama hated me. And then I proceeded to give all this evidence that was the exact opposite of her hating me, because it was a joke. She doesn't really hate me, but here I am having to explain the joke, which kills the joke. So what we got here is a case of jokicide, and that particular joke is now lying motionless and face down in a puddle of its own blood. Actually, my sweetheart's mama and I get along fine. We are actually fond of each other. Also, another thing I should address is that I mentioned that there were people making accusations about me on the internet. And I said that, as an extreme example, I said that somebody had accused me of being kicked out of the monkhood for molesting boys. And then I went to some lengths to point out that you can't really get kicked out of the monkhood. I mean, the only person that can kick a monk out of the monkhood is that monk himself. So because of that, it was like I was dodging the accusation about molesting boys and just emphasizing the getting kicked out of the monkhood part. But no, it's like it was just a made up fabrication. I think, if I remember correctly, they were even saying that I was kicked out of Thailand. Apparently they didn't even know that I was ordained in a Burmese tradition and just lived in Burma. So I would say that if you see any accusations against me on the internet, like in a Buddhist forum or comment section or whatever, just ask the person what their source of information is, and I guarantee you that their source of information is just imagination or a very exaggerated, distorted version of what I myself have publicly admitted to on my own blog. And it was nowhere near to anything that would get me excommunicated or any such thing. So, having gotten that out of the way, I should commence to answering questions. And the first question is from Austin. And Austin says, how would an enlightened being know if they are enlightened if there is no comprehension of an ultimate self? Well, I mean, it's trying to second guess enlightened beings, how they know this or how they know that, is kind of ridiculous. But, I mean, if you know ultimate reality, I mean, you know that you know it. I mean, knowing that you know it is probably the same as just knowing it. Although I have to admit, there are a lot of people, probably most people, who claim sincerely to be enlightened probably are not. So you can be mistaken. And in fact, there is a little loophole for a monk who claims to be enlightened when he really isn't. If it's a sincere, honest mistake, he's not excommunicated. Only if a monk is lying deliberately about being enlightened is he excommunicated. He's parajika. He's kicked out of the monkhood for the rest of his life. So, I mean, if there's no comprehension of an ultimate self, I don't know how that would even be relevant. I don't know how that would even be a factor. I mean, the main question is, how do you know if you're really enlightened or not? And yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one, because like I just said, some people think that they're enlightened but really aren't. And that's just completely setting aside the con men who know that they aren't but say that they are anyway. So my advice to Austin on that would be to get enlightened yourself, and then you'll know. You won't need explanations. So we'll just move on to Austin's next question. With all due respects to my kind of not answering his first question, which is, I feel like a lot of drugs in my youth and my ADHD has affected my ability to remember things. Is there any way I can improve my sati, or my mindfulness? And yeah, I mean, the answer to that, the obvious answer to that, is just diligently practice mindfulness. It really helped me. I was a very absent-minded person. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, you know, I'd come to class, I'd sit down, and then I'd remember, oh, I forgot that. You know, I forgot something in my locker. I'd rush to my locker, go to the locker, and then I'd be standing there like, what was it that I came here to get? And then I'd forget again, and then I'd go back empty-handed, and it'd already be late, like the second bell had already rung, and then I'd realize, oh yeah, that's what I forgot. And just practicing mindfulness, it does help. I mean, sati, or mindfulness, I mean, sati in Pali also means memory, and it does improve your memory if you do practice mindfulness. So practice mindfulness just diligently, and the more you put into it, the more you'll get out of it. That's the way Dhamma works. So, I mean, that's really the only answer. Just, you have to practice diligently, practice mindfulness, and your mindfulness will get better. So I'll just move on to Austin's third question here. How can Buddhism teach me to improve my impulse control? I feel like impulsivity is what I struggle with most. Again, if you practice mindfulness, then you see the impulse and you're able to note it before you just mechanically, like habitually act upon the impulse. So mindfulness it creates a kind of philosophical detachment. You know, like the urge, let's just say you're sitting there meditating and you just get this impulse to scratch your nose because your nose itches. And a lot of people, it's just the hand just immediately comes up to the nose without them thinking or anything, because they're just conditioned to behave in like this reflexive knee-jerk kind of manner. But if you get used to practicing mindfulness, then you see the urge arise, and then you have more of an ability to resist just reaching up and scratching your nose, because let's say you're supposed to remain motionless in meditation posture. Although I remember like sitting in meditation and, you know, just determining I wasn't going to be moving while I was sitting there, and then of course your cheek itches or your nose itches, which can be maddening, and it'd be like my arm would just be twitching. You know, it was like the arm was wanting to come up and scratch the itchy face, but mindfulness was sufficient to prevent the arm from coming up, even though it may not have been sufficient to avoid just the arm muscles just automatically starting to contract or flex in order to reach up and scratch my nose. But I mean, it's not just nose scratching, it can be anything like anger or anything like that. The more you practice mindfulness, the more you see the mental state arise and you see the urge arise, and then you can decide whether acting upon that urge is appropriate or not, instead of just mindlessly, habitually, reflexively acting upon your impulses. So again, mindfulness, diligent practice of mindfulness is the panacea that will cure this sort of thing, but you have to practice it diligently. So let's move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, what is the word suchness in Pali, and what does it mean? Actually, there's a number of words for suchness. I think the main one would be like datata. What data means like this, and then adding another ta at the end turns it into like an abstract noun. So it'd be like suchness. But then there's also words like tadi, which occur in like the Sutta Nipata other suttas, I suppose, that also mean just like such or like this. And it's a synonym for like reality or the state of enlightenment, because it's something that can't be put into words. And so you just use kind of a makeshift word that's like a vague, just like this meaning to explain it. Like the term Tathagata is like he who has attained such, or he who has become like this. And that this or such is just like a finger pointing at reality or pointing at enlightenment without trying to explain it. You know, the finger pointing at the moon, and the moon is enlightenment. So, yeah, there's a number of words. You know, awam also means something like thus, that can be used as a kind of jargon for explaining what really can't be explained in words. So that's fairly common, I think, in ancient Indian philosophy in general. You find it in the Upanishads also, like dat dvam asi. This is that. Dat dvam asi. So I think I'll just move on to Siyovakshan Sipat Zidana's next question. And he already asked this question, and I didn't answer it to his satisfaction because he didn't specify exactly the context. It says here, I asked about the gradual training in the last Q&A. I meant to ask about it from Majjhima Nikaya number 107 instead of, I think it was like number 51 or something that I used as a reference last time. Can you please break it down step by step? Well, yeah, I guess I can. Even though technically he's got 4 questions. But this is like a double episode. This is like a double album kind of a thing. So, Majjhima Nikaya number 107, the Ganaka Moggallana Sutta. And I'm relying on Bhikkhu Bodhi's and Ajahn, or Venerable Nyanamoli's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya, which is a good translation. So, is it possible, Brahman, to describe gradual training, gradual practice, and gradual progress in this Dhamma discipline? And then he goes through this list. So first, he says, come, bhikkhu, be virtuous, restrained with the restraint of the patimokkha. Be perfect in conduct and resort, and seeing fear in the slightest fault, trained by undertaking the training precepts. So essentially you follow the rules of monastic discipline. And then you see fear, when you see fear in the slightest fault, and you train by undertaking the training precepts, then the Tathagata disciplines him further. Come, bhikkhu, guard the doors of your sense faculties. On seeing a form with the eye, do not grasp at its signs and features, since if you were to leave the eye faculty unguarded, evil, unwholesome states and covetousness and grease might invade you, etc., etc. And he goes on, on hearing a sound with the ear, on smelling an odor with the nose, tasting a flavor with the tongue, touching a tangible with the body, cognizing a mind object. You don't grasp on the details, and that's essentially mindfulness. I mean, if you're just in the seen, there's only the seen. In the heard, there's only the heard. You're not trying to process the data. You're trying to leave the sensory data as raw as possible. Instead of hearing a dog barking, which has an owner that does not discipline his dog sufficiently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which can just lead to this monologue. It's just hearing, and that's the basic of relatively advanced mindfulness, but it's not really identified as mindfulness here, because the next step, when Brahman, the bhikkhu, guards the doors of his sense faculties, then the Tathagata disciplines him further. Come, bhikkhu, be moderate in eating. Why you would wait until, after your sense faculties are guarded, that you would then start being moderate in eating, I don't know. But then after that comes be devoted to wakefulness, which means essentially not sleeping very much. Generally the ideal is like 1/3 of the night, which is approximately 4 hours. Then, after you're devoted to wakefulness, the Tathagata disciplines him further. Come, bhikkhu, be possessed of mindfulness and full awareness, which it seems to me would be part, that's closely related. There's a lot of overlap between that and just guarding the sense doors. So it's like, let's see here. Act in full awareness when going forward and returning, act in full awareness when looking ahead and looking away, act in full awareness when flexing and extending your limbs, etc. So yeah, that's mindfulness, clear comprehension, sati sampajanya, which is, fundamental. I mean, that's just a fundamental practice for monks who are striving for enlightenment that goes all the way back to the Attaka Wagga, just the earliest teachings of Buddhism. So anyways, then when the bhikkhu possesses mindfulness and full awareness and the Tathagata disciplines him further, come bhikkhu, resort to a secluding resting place, the foot of a tree, a mountain, a ravine, a hillside cave, a charnel ground, a jungle thicket, an open space, a heap of straw. So it may be that he has to be trained before he can go off alone and sit under a tree, but again, like I was saying in the first time I answered this in the Q&A with regard to a different sutta, this is just kind of an arbitrary division up into a temporal sequence, when in all likelihood, a lot of this would all be simultaneous. I don't see why you would have to wait until you've accomplished all these other things before you go off and sit alone under a tree, unless it's indicating that after you've been a monk under a preceptor for at least 5 years or 5 rains retreats, then you can go off and live alone. It might be implying that, but I think there's a good chance that it's just like an arbitrary arrangement of various practices of a monk into a temporal sequence in order to make it easier to list them in a sutta. So anyways, let's see. Oh, okay, after you find the secluded resting place for yourself, then you cultivate, let's see here. Then he meditates, abandoning covetous for the world. He abides with a mind free of covetousness. He purifies his mind from covetousness. Okay, so he's dealing with the 5 hindrances. So you try to eliminate the 5 hindrances, at least temporarily. Just set yourself up for good meditative states. And then after that, let's see here. Oh, okay. So then he attains the 4 jhanas. And then that's it. And this is my instruction, Brahman, to those who are in the higher training whose minds have not yet attained the goal, who abide aspiring to the supreme security from bondage. But these things conduce both to a pleasant abiding here and now and to mindfulness and full awareness for those bhikkhus who are arahants with taints destroyed, who have lived the holy life, done what had to be done, laid down the burden, reached the true goal, destroyed the fetters of being, and are completely liberated through final knowledge. So I think a lot of the basic practices are artificially divided up into a temporal sequence until you get to the 4 jhanas, and then in a lot of the suttas, 4th jhana is considered to be just like the natural jumping off place into enlightenment. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it very, very well in a Q&A like this, because I've got approximately 50 questions to answer. But I mean, it's just the basic practices of a monk that are described in many suttas, except here it's sort of artificially divided up into a temporal sequence, just like I think it was Majjhima Nikaya number 51 was, when really probably a lot of these will be practiced simultaneously pretty much from the get-go. So, yeah, I mean, you take care of all, you follow the rules, you restrain your senses, you sleep as little as possible, you show moderation in eating, which probably should be practiced from day 1, and then you eliminate, or at least sort of reduce the 5 hindrances until you can get into jhana states through formal meditation, and then you go through to 4th jhana, you master 4th jhana, and then if you're going to become enlightened, at least according to some suttas, it is implied that it's easiest to become enlightened from 4th jhana, or after having mastered 4th jhana. And St. John of the Cross kind of goes with the similar principle, just completely independent of Buddhism, probably in his own practice of Catholic contemplation. You have to master contemplation, which is at least 2nd jhana, before you can become an adept, and then it's from the stage of the adept that you move on to the stage of the perfect, which would essentially correspond to an arahant in Theravada Buddhism. But I think a lot of the previous stages before you get enlightened, it's just an artificial division, more or less arbitrary division into a temporal sequence. Then when a lot of it, in all likelihood, is cultivated simultaneously. You don't have to master one before you move on to the next. Same with Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. It's considered to be a temporal sequence. You have to master Sila. If you have to purify your morals before you can purify your mind, and you have to purify your mind before you can just become enlightened. Purify your wisdom, but to some degree they're all simultaneous. It's like a tripod. The three hold each other up. You have to have some wisdom before you'll even want to purify your morals, for example. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here from Siovach and Sipad Zidana, which is as follows. When you said there is no connection between one blink and another of Dhammas according to Abhidhamma, isn't that one of the main points of the Bhavanga? And the Bhavanga is found only in the Abhidhamma the Abhidhamma philosophy. It's not found in the suttas. I think excuse me, I think Bhavanga does appear in the suttas, but with a completely different meaning. Bhavanga literally means like a limb of existence or factor of existence, and it's the closest there is in Abhidhamma philosophy to like a subconscious mind. According to the Abhidhamma philosophy, your very last mental state, your very last thought before you die becomes like a test pattern like throughout your next existence. So let's say your last thought is like an image of your family. Let's say they're standing around your deathbed and then you die. So then the entire next existence, it's like if you're not thinking anything, let's say you're in a deep sleep or something, then there's just going to be this test pattern like on TV sets a long time ago, where there's just going to be this family from your previous existence is just going to be like the standard picture that's there in your mind when you're not thinking anything, and you're not aware of it because you're not really thinking anything. But yeah, I mean, it's the thing is that this Bhavanga Chitta is also existing from one moment to the next. And he brought this up because I was pointing out that according to Orthodox Theravada, not Sarvastivada or certain other schools of Buddhism, but according to Theravada, everything is blinking in and out of existence at about 1 trillion times per eye blink. And so I pointed out that just completely disrupts any continuity. You can't have any kind of momentum going because everything in the universe is just going completely out of existence into a state of nothingness before the next moment blinks them back in again. So there's like this severance. I mean, it might as well be 1 million years between blinks, between these flashes in and out of existence, because there's nothing in between to cause any kind of continuity. Everything is just arising out of nothing. And that is a weakness in Abhidhamma that they really can't explain it. I asked an Abhidhamma scholar once, what causes that? And he was Burmese, so he said, there's an idea of ahon, and ahon in Burmese means momentum. But how can you have momentum when there's nothing there? They can't answer that. So I guess to some degree the Sarvastivada Buddhists would at least avoid that difficulty by claiming that the elemental dhammas or dharmas, the ultimate realities that exist like atoms, that they're not blinking in and out. It's the only impermanence is in the combination of them. Those are sankharas, but the elemental dharmas are eternal, according to Sarvastivada, or at least that's what I've read about Sarvastivada. So that would make more sense, because I really don't know how you get past the idea of everything blinking completely out of existence so that there's just nothing. And then the next moment, the next trillionth of a second, everything's blinking back into existence again based on a momentum that couldn't possibly exist because there was nothing, a split moment before that. So, I mean, if there's any Abhidhamma scholars out there who would like to straighten us all out on how that is possible, go right ahead. I mean, if you're Abhidhamma scholars and you can explain how gravity works from the Theravadan point of view, or from the Abhidhamma point of view, because Abhidhamma was an attempt to explain everything, to explain the entire universe. And they forgot to mention gravity. So that would be good to at least, maybe I just didn't notice it. Maybe it's in some obscure text that doesn't get translated in English or something. Most of Patana hasn't been translated into English, as far as I know. So anyways, I think I'll just move on to Siovakshana Sipad Zidano's next question here. He says, I don't think cheetahs are caused by other cheetahs, they are caused by kama and the sense bases. Although how karmic information is stored is a completely different matter, does Theravada ever explain that? Cheetahs, kama itself is a kind of, it has to have an accompanying cheetah. Cheetah and Chaitasika, again, we're talking Theravada Buddhist Abhidhamma, which is orthodox. This is the orthodox party line of Theravada Buddhism. You can't have consciousness or chitta without a Chaitasika or a mental state that accompanies it. They arise and disappear simultaneously. They have to arise in the same point in time. They have to disappear at the same point in time. So, why you even say that they're different if they can't possibly be separated? That's another philosophical question to be wrangled with, I suppose. So, the sense bases also are poofing in and out of existence at a trillion times of mind blank. In fact, the sense bases, being physical matter, would be 17 times slower than the mental states, because there are 17 mind moments for every moment of matter, according to Orthodox Theravada. So, let's see. Although how karmic information is stored is a completely different matter, does Theravada ever explain that? Well, if the only explanation is that it is just the momentum, even though the strict party line of Theravada that claims that everything is blinking in and out of existence would destroy the momentum. But so long as everything isn't just blinking out of existence so that you have nothingness in between each moment, you've got a split moment of nothingness, just separating each moment of mind and matter. If you can just do away with that, then momentum would seem to be, if not a perfect explanation, at least a way better one. So momentum. So I'll just move on to Siovakshana and Sipad Zidana's fourth question. Man, maybe this is even 5. 1, 2. Yeah, this is 5 questions. Shame on you, Siovakshana and Sipad Zidana, for asking so many questions, because the rule is 3, but considering this is like a double episode, I'll let it slide, and he will not be punished this time. So, his last question here is, what are the implications of this on Dhamma practice? And he linked to an article about how poor people receive a less pleasurable stimulus when they are rewarded. And there's some truth to that, I suppose. They did a scientific study on it. Although I would guess that studies like this are run to fuel the everyone is special, everyone deserves a trophy kind of mentality that is popular on the social and political left lately. But if they're referring to unprivileged people nowadays, that they receive less of a pleasurable stimulus from being rewarded, and so they're less motivated to excel, which is a way of explaining, how underprivileged people are underprivileged because, they're so beaten down that they don't even really have the motivation to excel, this sort of thing. In pre-modern times, pretty much everybody was underprivileged, certainly by modern standards. Even people who were very rich in like ancient times, still their standard of living was in many ways far inferior to somebody living on welfare nowadays. No electricity, no running water, it's like, so I'm not sure what the implications of this on Dhamma practice would be. You're trying to be an ascetic anyway, you're trying to be indifferent to rewards anyway. If you're being a serious Buddhist practitioner, you really shouldn't be practicing for rewards anyhow. You should be practicing, as just out of an ideal of sacred duty or some such, or maybe just a sincere desire to end suffering and or delusion. So I'm not sure exactly what the implications of this would be on Dharma practice, but I would imagine that they are not really game changers. It's nothing profound or earth-shaking. It's just sort of a subtle difference between people of the upper classes and people of, less privileged classes. It might help to explain why people of the upper classes are more attracted to Buddhism than people of the lower classes. At least in ancient India, like when Buddhism was just starting, it was mainly a higher caste sort of movement, more of an intellectual movement, educated people, and that's kind of the way it is in the West nowadays too. Not a lot of ghetto Buddhism in America. So, yeah, there may be implications, but Dhamma remains Dhamma. It's not going to really change anything important. That you just do the best you can under the circumstances, and if you were born into a situation in which you naturally feel less dopamine hit upon being rewarded, that's just part of your karma. Your own karma landed you wherever you happen to be, which is an idea so anti-leftist that leftists are trying to abolish that idea from Buddhist philosophy, at least leftist Buddhists. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Andreas. And Andreas says, does anatta really mean no self? I read from a few scholars now that it actually means not self, and that the Buddha is not denying the existence of an immortal soul, but rather pointing to what is not part of that immortal soul, the 5 skandhas. He uses the Sanskrit word, in Pali would be khandhas. It kind of makes sense considering that all the memories of past lives have to be stored somewhere inside the soul, in parentheses he has, like question mark, and can be accessed as described many times in the suttas. And it's true Ajahn Chah prefers not self to no self as a translation of the term anatta, but it seems to me that most of the people who are adopting this kind of argument, again, have this self-view. They just stubbornly, vehemently, desperately cling to an idea of them having an ultimately real individual selfhood. And Buddhism just doesn't teach that. For example, this should clinch it. You've got the 3 marks of existence, the tilakkhana, Sabbe sankhara anicca, all conditioned things are impermanent. Sabbe sankhara dukkha, all conditioned things are unsatisfying, conducive to unease. And then finally, you've got sabbe dhamma anatta. And dhamma does not mean a conditioned thing, it means anything, including nibbana itself, including ultimate reality. None of it is a self. That's why they use sabbe dhamma for the third one, for anatta, but not sabbe dhamma for what is impermanent and what is conducive to unhappiness or unease, because those apply only to conditioned realities, to what has a beginning and an end. But sabbe dhamma anatta implies even nibbana, even the highest reality, is not self. So you can call it not self, but that's not implying that there is a self, and it's just not what is on the list of the 5 khandhas or whatever. It's that nothing is a self. There is no self, and nothing, including nibbana itself, is a self. So, I think the best approach to people that insist that there really is a self is just kind of harumph quietly and just stop listening or walk somewhere else or something. That was a joke, by the way. And I just said that it was a joke, so now that one also is lying face down in a puddle of its own blood. So, I'll just move on to Andreas's next question here. And I'm doing pretty well. My lungs are holding up, and I've hardly coughed or blown my nose or anything. That's nice. So, Andreas's next question. The common notion in Buddhism is that there is no creator God, but the suttas describe many different kinds of Brahma beings, which are mighty creator gods that created different worlds and universes. Is that notion just watered down Western Buddhism, or how they come to that conclusion? really the Brahmas are not creator gods. There is a heaven realm called the gods who delight in their own creations. But I mean, it's not this world. Their creations are up in that heaven realm where they're just creating any kind of environment that they want to live in and delighting in that. But the idea of a creator God is described in the text, and it's kind of a weird description or a weird explanation. In that, like, the universe has to be destroyed occasionally. You know, the cosmos is destroyed, you know, after every zillion gajillion eons, usually by fire. And then you've got no physical universe, at least in this region of the cosmos. You know, you've got no physical world system. But then it has to re-evolve, and it re-evolves through the power of karma. Because there's this karma of people having to live in a physical world or a seemingly physical world, and that need, that psychic need, causes the universe to respawn, essentially. So one of the first things that respawns in this new physical universe is a throne of Brahma, and then after that, Brahma appears. And then he's just there sitting on his throne all by himself because nothing else has respawned yet. And he starts feeling lonely. And he starts thinking, gee, I wish there were other beings here around me so I wouldn't feel so lonely. And right about that same time, just through the force of karma, more beings start appearing in this respawning universe. And then that first Brahma starts thinking, wow, I wanted those beings to exist, and now they exist. So I must have created them. I'm creating this universe. And that's in the suttas. I mean, that's like this standard explanation for belief in a creator God is a kind of deluded Brahma thinking that just because he was the first being in the newly respawned cosmos, that he was causing everything else to arise around him, when really it was just kind of a coincidence that he was lonely and then other beings started arising. So they don't create different worlds and universes. They might have some sort of, I don't know what you call it, sort of almost like a political authority. You know, they're the overseers of universes and so forth, but they really don't have the power to create any beings, any real beings anyway, or send anybody to heaven or hell or anything like that. They're just more advanced beings than we are. They live longer than us. They don't get sick like we do. No nose blowing in the Brahma realms. No coughing. So, yeah. So, is that notion just watered down Western Buddhism, or how do they come to that conclusion? They really don't come to the conclusion. It's a misunderstanding here on the part of Andreas, at least with regard to Theravada Buddhism. In Mahayana Buddhism, they've converted Gautama Buddha himself or some other cosmic mythological Buddha into a kind of real deity, but in Buddhism, there are small g gods, but there's no capital G singular God. And the small g gods are just beings that are more powerful than us, and they really have no spiritual power over us whatsoever because our lives are governed by our own karma. So, I'll just move on to Andreas's next question here. Do you have recommendations for books or general tips if someone wants to learn Pali and Sanskrit? Well, I really am not an authority on Sanskrit. I never studied Sanskrit systematically. I did learn Pali, though, which is easier than Sanskrit, sort of like Spanish is easier than Latin. The books I used for studying Pali was I think it was called the New Pali Course by a Sri Lankan monk. I can't remember his name. I've been told that A.K. Warder's Pali grammar is very good. It's probably the most accessible, probably the easiest one to get. Also, I do have a Pali grammar published in 1902. It's like the first edition. It's back on my bookcase by Charles Durosell, which has probably been out of print for decades. But that one also is usable. I mean, they're all usable. Just find a good Pali grammar, and anyone who knows enough to write a Pali grammar text understands Pali grammar. It's really not extremely difficult. So, the new Pali course, or maybe it's the newer Pali course. I think it's the new Pali course by a Sri Lankan monk, and unfortunately I don't even remember his name. That it comes in 3 volumes, although the 3rd volume is you're not really learning anything new. It's just practicing by like translating Pali verses and so forth. But the first 2 were useful for me, and after you read the first 2 volumes of the new Pali course, or after I did, then I just got a Pali English dictionary and just started working my way through the Vinaya Pitaka, which is, for a monk, it makes sense to read the Vinaya Pitaka. And I read the whole thing, aside from the very last book, the Pariwara, which contains almost no new rules anyway, but it's very straightforward, simple Pali. When you start getting into complicated stuff like the commentaries or poetry, then it becomes more difficult. But just reading from the Vinaya, it's very elementary kind of Pali for the most part, although it does have some terms that essentially nobody knows for sure what the meaning is, because it might occur just 1 or 2 times in the entire Tipitaka with not enough context for you to know exactly what it means. It's like a list of plants that a monk is not supposed to do something with, then you don't know what that plant is supposed to be, but that's okay. You just do the best you can. So, do you have recommendations for books or general tips if someone wants to learn Pali? Yeah, get a good Pali grammar. Like, I guess A.K. Warder's Pali grammar is good, and like I already said, that's probably the most accessible nowadays. And just gradually work your way through it, and get a good Pali English dictionary, and just start reading Pali, and just gradually grinding your way through until you can finally read it without having the dictionary there all the time. So that would be my advice for that. And so I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Fred, and Fred says, is looking at nude women really sinful? It can be used as a skillful means of stopping delusions about other bodies? ? Well, I'm gonna need some energy drink for this one. Drink plenty of fluids, that's what they tell you. Hasn't worked for me very well, but what the heck? Fluids are good. Man cannot live by bread alone. There must also be a beverage. So, Fred says, is looking at nude women really sinful? Well, again, just looking at something is morally neutral. It's the accompanying mental states. If you look at a nude woman and you're thinking, cool, stone me, then yeah, you're going to get reborn as an amoeba because of that. But if you look at a nude woman and you're just indifferent, you have equanimity, or maybe you're a doctor and you're just examining this nude woman, or you're just completely in business mode, looking for some kind of health issue or something, then no, there's no problem at all. So yeah, it depends on the mental states. And it can be used as a skillful means of stopping delusions about other bodies. As a general rule, it doesn't work very well. I've met young monks who are telling me that, they try to reduce lust by visualizing like female rotting corpses swarming with maggots and so forth, and it just doesn't work. That sort of thing ultimately doesn't work. You're just going to have to practice Dhamma and improve in wisdom until you just get the insight that, it's, that sort of thing just isn't for you anymore. So, if you can look at a nude woman without lust, without craving and attachment and so forth, then there's nothing wrong with it. But especially for a monk who is celibate, you shouldn't be looking at them out of any kind of desire for pleasure. You shouldn't be thinking about them out of any kind of desire for pleasure. Just set it aside, don't go there, not appropriate, and then just move on, continue forwards. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from some joker named PSA saying, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? And I do believe that the orthodox response to this question is, as much wood as a woodchuck would chuck if a woodchuck would. I think that is the orthodox correct answer to that question. And I'm living in South Carolina where there actually are woodchucks. I remember the first time I saw a dead woodchuck or groundhog lying by the side of the road. I wasn't sure what it was at first. I was kind of intrigued by this large brown dead rodent lying there, and then finally it dawned on me. It's a groundhog. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, I'm wondering what your sources are on those historical folks believing that Lao Tzu being the Buddha or Buddha taught. This definitely reminds me of revisionist historians dedicated on rewriting history to fit their leftist narrative. I just, got done reading that there was a back and forth going on between the Taoist and Buddhist in the early 1st century. The Taoists were saying that Lao Tzu went as far as India when he headed west and was born the Buddha to spread the sages' teaching of Tao. Then the Buddhists turned the tables by reversing this myth. You know already, as soon as you hear of someone being born from an armpit, well, Houston, we have a problem. Yeah, Buddha wasn't born from an armpit, was he? Or maybe he's talking about Lao Tzu. Well, anyway, I should answer this question, shouldn't I? So my sources are on those historical folks believing that Lao Tzu being the Buddha or Buddha taught. Well, a long time ago, I read a penguin translation of the Tao Te Ching by some translator who was a linguist, did not understand Taoism apparently, but I mean he was a literal linguist. He was sort of like K.R. Norman translating Pali texts, where K.R. Norman is mainly interested in like ancient Prakrit languages. He is a philologist first and foremost. He doesn't really care about Buddhist philosophy, and this translator really didn't care that much about Taoism. He didn't really understand it very well. Like he was saying that Taoism is emphatically not a mystical system, completely disregarding the very first words in the Tao Te Ching, which is the Tao that, but the name that can be named is not the eternal name. The Tao that can be shown is not the eternal Tao, which is mystical. But he didn't get it. Intellectuals, as often as not, more often than not, just do not get mysticism. Bless their hearts, they're really intelligent, they just don't get it because they're so locked into intellect that anything that just leaves intellect behind, they just despise it or shrink away from it in horror or something. But anyway, in his introduction, he was pointing out that Lao Tzu really, there is no historical personage named Lao Tzu, and he's pointing out evidence that Lao Tzu was just kind of a mythological invented character that was invented after Taoism had begun as a kind of like a mystical, or in his case, he was saying that Taoism arose during the Warring States period in ancient China as a means of just keeping your head down, staying anonymous so that you're not going to get killed by warring states. It's just, he was saying it was just a kind of survival guide on how to just be anonymous and invisible so that you're not going to catch fire during all these civil wars going on. And there might have been something to that, but obviously the Tao Te Ching is not simply a survival guide on for people to survive ancient civil wars. But anyway, he did put forth evidence that Lao Tzu really did not have any historical, there was no historical evidence that he actually was a real person, and this author was favoring the idea that he was just a legend. And there's considerable evidence for that I won't get into, mainly because I just don't remember it very well. And then there's been this movement of a kind of Buddhist revisionism that's got a lot of truth to it, that's saying that the Buddha and his Sakya clan were not Indo-Aryans. They spoke more of a Persian language originally, that they were sort of a kind of Persic tribe that invaded India, And I also just recently looked at an article that was saying that the Vajis and the Mallas, who are mentioned repeatedly in the Pali text, were also originally a Persian kind of tribe. And he's pointing out that, what am I trying to say here? The whole idea of the Dhamma wheel and calling the Buddha the Aditya Bandhu, or kinsman of the sun, that's all Persian symbolism and not really Indian symbolism. And so apparently there were Persian tribes coming into India and settling in India. I mean, they weren't necessarily part of the Persian Empire. I mean, they weren't Iranians necessarily, because there are a lot of other tribes, in ancient times and in modern times, that speak a language related to Persian that really are not Iranian, like the Tajik language. Even though they got their own country of Tajikistan, they speak a language that's related to Iranian. It's like Indo-Iranian. It's a member of the Iranian branch of the Indo-Iranian language family. So anyways, this guy, whose name I don't remember, unfortunately, but he's made quite a splash in Western Buddhist circles lately. He was saying that the Buddha was Iranian or Persian, and was, in a way, kind of backhandedly, without admitting to it, denouncing Zoroastrianism. And this same author, again, I'm sorry I don't remember his name, he also puts forth an argument that Lao Tzu really was just the Buddha himself coming through like a filter of Chinese mythology. So, if anyone remembers the name of this author, who has made quite a splash, and there are serious scholars that are kind of revising their views, especially with regard to the amount of Persian type people living in the Ganges Valley. Although it's strange to me that I cannot remember a single time in the entire Sutta Pitaka or the entire Tipitaka where the nation of Persia is explicitly mentioned. There are mention of tribes like the Kambodjas. In ancient times, they were a barbarian tribe living on the northwestern border somewhere that spoke like an Iranic, Persic language, more closely related to Persian than to an Indian language like Sanskrit. But it is kind of strange to me that there's no explicit mention of Persia in the texts. Although some authors are saying, that the whole Aditya Bandhu, the kinsman of the sun, and the Dhamma wheel, which is like the sun, it's all a way of conquering India through propaganda. That they were sent as agents by the Persian king, Darius the Great or something, to infiltrate India and try to conquer India through Dhamma, or through peaceful means, which is sort of what the Chakravartin does. The king of the world, the wheel-turning monarch in Buddhist mythology, Buddhist philosophy, whatever you want to call it, that he conquers the world through Dhamma. In other words, he doesn't do it militarily, he does it peacefully. And that, according to the argument, is what the Persian king or emperor was doing in India. He's sending these tribes, these Iranian tribes, into India, and sort of trying to get India to become like vassals or a satellite of Persia. And I really don't know what the exact merits of that argument are. I have had the idea for a long time that the Buddha himself may have been ancestrally more Persian than Indian, simply because Sakka, which is the Shakyan in Pali is pronounced Sakka or Sakya. And it sounds like Scythian, where also there was a people called the Sakkas who were Persian. They spoke a Persian language, who invaded northwestern India and conquered it. That was long after the Buddhist time. But still, the Buddhist clan and Sakka and Scythia, Scythia, have a resemblance, and so I consider that might be a possibility. And also, that would be why the Buddha was considered to be a Kshatriya. He had a Brahmin family name, Gautama, which was traditionally a Brahmin name, but he was a member of the Kshatriya caste according to tradition, and that might just be because he was a member of warlike tribe that invaded either before or after the Vedic invasion. I really don't know. So I'm going to drink more Red Bull now. So this is getting into a really long answer to a not very long question here. But yeah, I'm sorry I can't remember the name of the guy. A friend of mine who was, I think he's called the Bio Individual on YouTube, did at least one interview with this guy about how the Buddha was like a Persian propagandist essentially. But I'm sure you can find out if you look around. So that was my main sources for this idea, that Lao Tzu was really just a kind of mythologized Buddha as viewed in China in ancient times. But I don't know if that's true or not. There is good evidence that Lao Tzu really did not exist as a historical personage, but whether he's like a crypto Buddha or not, I don't know. So I think I'll just move on to White Ash Piper's next question here, which is there indeed anything new under the sun or not? I think there's indeed new things under our sun, Helios, Sol Invictus, up in the sky there. Yeah, I don't think that any other civilization before us came up with cell phones, computer chips, that kind of thing. That's new. I'm pretty sure there were no internal combustion engines, at least not good ones, before the 20th century or the very late 19th century in Western civilization. So at least that kind of stuff, computers and just modern technology, that's new. Probably certain ideas are relatively new, just because they're partly influenced by modern technology and so forth. But considering that this universe, just assuming that this universe has existed forever and extends into infinity, then yeah, there would be nothing new. Ultimately there'd be nothing new, because it's all been here before, some form or another, because it's just in an infinite universe. Anything that possibly can exist does exist and is existing and has existed and will exist again, but not under our exact sun. So that's the thing that makes it new, is that it's under this particular sun and not some other sun. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, according to Digha Nikaya 4 and Digha Nikaya 5, the 32 marks of holy man is not a Buddhist thing. It was just Brahmins' Vedic teaching, and Brahmins were just trying to analyze Buddha with their method, as I understand. What's your opinion on that? K.R. Norman, in his translation of the Sutta Nipata, talks about the 32 marks. I think it's in reference to the introduction to the Pavarana Vaga, which is the last chapter of the Sutta Nipata. And he is saying that the whole idea of the 32 marks of the Mahapurisa, or the great man, came from a teacher named Bavari. And Bavari, according to K.R. Norman, who is a linguist, he is a philologist, means the Babylonian. So it could be that the whole idea of the 32 marks of the great man comes from the Middle East, possibly Persia. It could fit in with the whole Persian conspiracy theory. Some conspiracy theories are true, of course. Might have come from Babylonia, or just Mesopotamia in general. So yeah, it wasn't invented by the Buddhists, I'm pretty sure. It's just something that happened to be floating around in ancient Indian culture at the time, and just got incorporated into some suttas. And just kind of a way of demonstrating that the Buddha was, a Buddha. Sort of like all these little bits of evidence in the New Testament about, demonstrating that Jesus was really the Messiah, like he was born in Bethlehem and his mother was a virgin and all this stuff. That also is a little bit of monkeying with the facts in order to make him fit the prophecies of the Messiah. And that sort of thing may have happened to some degree with regard to the Buddha also, like with regard to these 32 marks, all 32 of which could not possibly be found on the same person. And even if most of these marks were found on the same person, he would be some sort of mutated monstrosity and not a handsome man. So I won't wade into that particular issue, although I have waded into it previously. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, if someone starts to practice Dhamma, how many lives would it take for him to become an arahant? Well, that depends on the individual. Somewhere in the text it talks about how there are 4 kinds of progress in Dhamma. There's fast and happy, slow and happy, fast and miserable, and slow and miserable. And there were times when I was a monk when I was thinking maybe I was in the slow and miserable camp. But it's just going to depend on the individual, you know, how wise they are when they start practice Dhamma, how much like parami, you know, how much talent and facility they have for the practice of Dhamma. Some people, when they first sit down to meditate, they just go into a deep meditative state. Other people, they never get past the my knee hurts stage, or what do I want for lunch stage. So it depends on the individual. Some of them, it might be relatively fast, like according to the Satipatthana Sutta, if you can practice like intensive Satipatthana for a week straight, then you're guaranteed of at least becoming an anagami. So, I mean, then the question is, I mean, how many people can actually practice intensive Satipatthana for a week straight, the way it is described in the text? It's probably a very tiny minority. So, yeah, I mean, it just depends on the individual. It might take thousands of lives for one person, and it might take one life for another person just because they were ripe for it. So, I mean, if you think about Buddhist philosophy and the idea of rebirth, I mean, all of us have been practicing Dhamma from time immemorial, you know, on previous earths. So, you start to practice Dhamma, and then most people, you know, they hit a stage where there is no Dhamma in the world or whatever, and they start backsliding or being led astray or whatever, and then they rediscover it, and they start practicing it again, and that can happen, you know, a zillion, gajillion times until they finally get off the wheel. So it depends on the individual. So I'll just move on to Pranav's next question. How to increase Sada Indriya? And you've really asked the wrong person on this one, because Sada Indriya, or the faculty of faith. And I consider faith to be, I mean, there are some people who say Sada doesn't necessarily mean faith, you know, belief in something that you don't really know. That it means just like confidence. You know, sometimes Sada is translated as confidence. There are at least two verses in the Sutta Pitaka that say a monk should have no faith. One's in the Sutta Nipata, and one is in the Dhammapada. But so I mean, Sada in the sense of just believing a dogma, you know, believing something even though you don't know it. I mean, that's really not good Dhamma. That's not good Buddhism. And that kind of faith you're better off without. At least someone like me. Because I really have considered faith, you know, as a Christian term. Faith is a kind of delusion. Because you think you know something that you don't really know. There's even an epistle of Paul in the New Testament pointing out that that's why it's called faith, is because they don't really know it. You know, it's just sort of a guess. And basing your life on a guess is gambling with your life, it seems to me. Gambling with your spiritual well-being. But there is, in Theravada Buddhism, what's called the 5 faculties, the pancha indriya, 5 faculties, and Sada is one of them. And let's see, you've got Sada and Panya have to be in balance. Sada is faith, and Panya in this case means something like intellect. So you got to have faith and intellect. Like, now it wouldn't be exactly like theory and practice. But let's just call it faith and intellect. If you have too much intellect and not enough faith, you're going to be a skeptic. You're going to not believe anything, even if it's true. On the other hand, if you have too much faith and not enough intellect, you're going to believe anything, no matter how ridiculous it is. You're going to become like a New Ager or something. Hope I didn't just offend all the New Agers. If it's just one or two, that's manageable. But New Agers, according to my experience, they can believe absolutely anything. So, I mean, they're more faith-oriented. And I've always been more intellect-oriented and more head-oriented. And so I kind of have more of a dim view of faith than a lot of people. But if you want to increase it, gosh, I guess one way of increasing faith would be to practice Dhamma, and you see from your own experience that you're making progress, that you have fewer desires, you have more equanimity and so forth. And then that would cause a kind of faith in Dhamma in general, even some of the aspects of it that you haven't mastered yet. You know, it gets you into a more confident attitude towards Dhamma in general if you've practiced some of it and gotten good at some of it and are getting benefits from that part that you're able to more or less master or get good at. Then it's going to cause you to have faith or confidence that, you know, the more you practice Dhamma, you know, the wiser and happier, or at least less miserable you're going to be. So that would just practice Dhamma, I suppose. Practice it, you know, sincerely and conscientiously, and you'll make progress, which will increase your faith. But going by other methods, you know, just, I don't know, like getting indoctrinated or something, is not a good way of increasing your faith. And faith that's just kind of arbitrarily latched upon or thrust upon you, you know, it's not even necessarily going to be heading in the right direction. So, I mean, having faith in the Communist Party, I mean, it's not a good kind of faith. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Proto-Pseudo-Monk. And Proto-Pseudo-Monk says, what is the problem with the Ajahn Chah tradition? Is it the focus on jhana and neglecting satipatthana? And I think he's referring to maybe something that I said about the Ajahn Chah tradition. Maybe. I think the main problem with the Ajahn Chah tradition is it doesn't focus on meditation much at all. That's my experience with Ajahn Chah tradition, is a lot of Ajahn Chah monks really don't practice meditation very much. They might be sticklers on Vinaya, except for the certain rules that the Ajahn Chah tradition traditionally breaks. And there are some of those. But for the most part, they're relatively strict in Vinaya and conscientious monks. I'm not trying to badmouth Ajahn Chah monks, but you go to an Ajahn Chah monastery in Thailand, and there may not be a whole heck of a lot of meditation going on. And it's more conformity-oriented. Thai Buddhism in general is more conformity-oriented than, say, Burmese Buddhism. I mean, Southeast Asians in general are conformists, but it may be that the Burmese are just so, they're just automatically conformists and don't have to make a policy that you have to conform, whereas in Thailand, you have to conform. And that part is really doesn't work for me at all. So I lucked out in just stumbling upon a Burmese tradition right off the bat and being ordained in a Burmese tradition rather than a Thai tradition, because I liked Vinaya, I liked meditation, and I'm just not a conformist. I mean, I voluntarily conformed to the rules of monastic discipline because, you know, nobody was forcing me to become a monk. It just seemed like my duty, and so just of my own free will, I became a strict practitioner of Vinaya. But just having to wear the same uniform, even though it obviously goes against Vinaya, for example. Yeah, I mean, you just get, it's frowned upon at an Ajahn Chah monastery if you refuse to wear the uniform, even though technically speaking, the uniform is against the Pali Mokam. But I probably shouldn't get into that too much. But yeah, that would be the two main problems I personally would have with the Ajahn Chah tradition is, one, that a lot of Ajahn Chah monks just hardly meditate at all, And two, it's very conformity oriented. You have to conform regardless of whether it's in accordance with the ancient Pali texts or not. You just have to do what you're told, do what everybody else is doing. So, but all in all, the Ajahn Chah tradition is the most successful tradition in the West, and for good reason. It's got a lot going for it. So I'm really not trying to badmouth the Ajahn Chah tradition. So I'll just move on to the proto-pseudo monk's next question here, which is as follows. I'm going to have to take another drink here. Which is as follows. I am curious, you have said Mahasi method is limited and don't follow Ajahn Chah. Besides Goenka, I thought they were the only practices available for insight from my limited YouTube Buddhist education. Then what is the Theravada meditation practice we must follow to become enlightened? Well, that's a good question. The best meditation practice that I know that would be the most advanced would be like the meditation method of Mahamyang Uzodika in Burma, which, I mean, I guess it's no coincidence that it's similar to what I was practicing, where you're actually just eliminating the primary object, and eventually you're cultivating a state of emptiness. And the Mahasi method, as far as I know, does not teach that. Ajahn Chah, as I already said, is really not strong on meditation. A lot of Ajahn Chah monks will practice the Mahasi method just because that is more of a well-explained method than anything that arose from within the Ajahn Chah method. At least that's my understanding. And Goenka is very superficial in certain ways. It's a very simplified, stripped down kind of Theravada Buddhism. But I mean, there's lots of teachers out there belonging to obscure traditions that are not easily findable on YouTube. But just practicing mindfulness, and also if you have a meditation method that becomes quieter as your mind becomes quieter until you finally get to silence, just wide awake but still silent, then that is a good method. And there are teachers out there, I assume, like Mahamyang Uzodika, or Ujodika as he would be pronounced in the West, because the letter J in Pali is pronounced like a Z in Burma for some reason. Probably the Aboriginal Burmese language did not contain a letter J, or a letter R for that matter. So, yeah, let's see, what is the question here? What is the Theravada meditation practice we must follow to become enlightened? Just being mindful, just sati sampajanya, mindfulness and clear comprehension, that will get you farther without sitting meditation. Then sitting meditation will get you without just the mindfulness of daily activities, the mindfulness of your mental states as they arise throughout the course of the day, that sort of thing. But eventually, if you are going to do sitting meditation, you should get into a meditation method that just gets quieter and clearer and simpler until finally, I mean, you're just sitting there wide awake with your mind clear like glass. And I don't know what established tradition in Theravada is teaching that. I assume Ajahn Chah must have known it, and he might not have taught all of his disciples that, maybe some of the more advanced ones. Maybe even like Ajahn Brahm, despite his politics, he might have gotten into some advanced jhanic states, at least he claims to have. So, yeah, they're out there, but it's like you have to be ready for it. I mean, you have to have the karma to have it land in your lap, so to speak, or at least you have to have the karma to be able to find it. Because this sort of thing is very rare and priceless. You know, it is of inestimable value. And so, you know, what is valuable is going to be hard to get. The easier it is to get something, the less it is worth. So it might require, you know, climbing to the top of a mountain and braving, you know, hostile savages and so forth until you finally find it. In a way, it's kind of proving yourself worthy or purifying yourself or something. So I'm not sure how well I answered that question. I certainly didn't answer it in a clear few words that you can that proto-pseudo monk can just write down and type into his next YouTube search. But I did the best I could, I think. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is also from the proto-pseudo monk. He says, my impression is you recommend mindfulness without the noting, but recently Ajahn Chah gave a whole Vipassana series saying that Mahasi method has the precision that open awareness mindfulness may not see. The Ajahn is an advocate for the method, and I thought it would take you all the way to full enlightenment. Currently, I don't see any other practices that could yield the same result. Advice on gaining Vipassana, please. Well, even the Mahasi teachers in Burma themselves admit that the Mahasi method does not lead all the way to full enlightenment. That you have graduated the course, you have completed the course by becoming a Sotapanna. And there are some like Upandita, Mahasi Upandita, who at least hinted in very obvious ways that he was above the state of Sotapanna, but I don't know of any who were hinting that they were fully enlightened in Upandita. I mean, he may have considered himself to be a Sakadagami or something. But if that's the case, the Sakadagamis can get really angry on pretty much on a daily basis. So let's see, what's the question here? I'm starting to stray. I'm getting all fucked up on the taurine in this energy drink, I think. So let's see here. My impression is you recommend mindfulness without the noting. That's only for someone who is able to practice that. At first, you have to know. You know, you have to apply labels. You know, like the beginning mindfulness, whatever arises, just stick a label on it. You know, like remembering, itching, you know, pain, whatever. And then once you can be mindful of something without having to stick the label on, you know, you get better at your mindfulness, then the label is too much. I mean, it's overkill. You don't need that anymore. And then finally, you're just aware without even having to direct your attention to anything. You know, it's just your mind is like a mirror. It's all there, just crystal clarity without having to direct your attention at anything. So that would be the most advanced level, or a more advanced level anyway. So let's see. So Ajahn Chah gave a whole Vipassana series saying the Mahasi method has the precision that open awareness mindfulness may not see. It depends on how good you are at practicing these things. If you're good at it, then you're good at it. But open awareness mindfulness. Yeah, I mean, if a beginner tries open awareness mindfulness, they may think that they're practicing open awareness mindfulness, but in reality, it may be that their mind is going all over the place. And the Mahasi method does have a certain precision because, like Upandita is saying that when you're noting something, it's like you're hitting it with a stick. There's always this intention. There's always this effort. But intention and effort are just karma. And so if you can be in the state of crystal clarity and silence without intention and effort and hitting things with a stick, then you're doing better. And that may be one reason why the Mahasi method doesn't even claim to lead all the way to enlightenment. It's a kind of Sotapanna production factory, so to speak. So, currently I don't see any other practices that would yield the same result. Advice on gaining Vipassana, please. The best way to gain Vipassana is just practice and practice and practice and beat your head against a brick wall until you reach wit's end. Because to some degree, hitting a crisis point, reaching wit's end, is an absolute prerequisite to significant spiritual growth. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Buddha had monks just wandering homeless in wildernesses, you know, no friends, no money, not knowing where they're going to sleep, what they're going to eat the next day, because, I mean, it just slams you into this, I mean, it's almost designed that you're going to reach wit's end. You know, you have this idea about how things are supposed to be, and it just doesn't work, and you hit this crisis stage. But yeah, I really do think that like despair is a virtual prerequisite for gaining not just Vipassana, but like significant spiritual growth. Because right now we're stuck in a set of habits. And that set of habits is preventing us from becoming enlightened. So what you need is for that set of habits to get challenged. And just sitting alone in a comfortable meditation cell may not challenge it the way you need it to be challenged. It may be that you need it to be challenged by, confronting harsh realities out in the world somewhere. So, you really have to challenge yourself, and it's like your established set of habitual ways of dealing with the world are going to have to come under assault. They're going to have to take a beating, and a lot of that can be attained just through practicing strict Dhamma. Even just attending a meditation retreat, a lot of people who have attended meditation retreats can tell you that some people just crack up. It's just too much of an assault on their personality structure or whatever. But that's what asceticism is largely about. You've got to just go through the fire in a way, but not torture yourself, because that's not right either. So I hope I kind of answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Ride Forever. And I'm not sure if this is even a question here, but I put it on the list maybe just because it is worthy of comment. Because sometimes people will leave comments in the comments that aren't questions, but still they're just begging for a response. I mean, not deliberately begging for a response, but the comment itself is in a way implicitly begging for a response or something. But maybe there's a question mark in here somewhere. Anyways, Ride Forever says, if a monk follows or breaks rules, it's not the point. The point is the rules are irrelevant. In fact, all spiritual practices or doctrines or disciplines must have and did once have a real function. They were instruments. There are no such things as rules. They are only spiritual practices. But I am afraid all such things have been lost, and only faint echoes remain. After all, what sense does it make to say we don't really exist, but still need to meditate? Why monks fetishize about rules is they don't have anything else to do, as they stopped living. This is not, in fact, a correct view of the path. This is an error. The ridiculousness of human unintelligence cannot be overstated. So, Ride Forever here is saying that any monk who conscientiously follows the rules of the monkhood his unintelligence cannot be overrated or overstated. And this strikes me as bigotry. There is at least one scene in the text, I think it's in the Vinaya, where monks are asking the Buddha, why is it that we've got all these rules to follow, whereas previous Buddhas didn't have all these rules? Well, no, that's not the question. The question is, why is it that previous Buddhas did not have a dispensation that lasted for very long? That was the question. There were previous Buddhas, and they started Buddhism going again. They started the wheel of Dhamma, and then it just didn't last for very long. It just petered out. And then the Buddha said it's because they didn't have rules, because you have to have some kind of structure. And the thing is, with regard to these rules of monastic discipline, it's not sin. It's not like in Christianity. It's not like the Ten Commandments or like Mosaic law in the Old Testament, where it's God is decreeing you have to do this, or you are a bad person, or you're evil or something. It's just rules that are designed to make a monk's life simple and harmless. And to some degree, it helps the monk to not get caught up in too much decision making, because the rules are there to kind of, you learn to just follow it as a matter of habit, so that you're not even thinking about it much anymore. And you've been, I can say from my own experience that I was very strict at following the rules, even the picky, dumb rules. I followed them just because nobody forced me to become a monk. When you become a monk, it's an act of vinaya. Vinaya is what defines a monk, essentially. And so I wanted to be conscientious. Nobody forced me to become a monk. I might as well follow the rules. So I did. And then after a few years, at first, I mean, it kind of helps you to be mindful, because whenever you're going to do something, you're thinking, is this according to Vinaya, or is this not according to Vinaya? And so you're like observing your own behavior more than you would normally. But then, after it becomes just a matter of habit, you're just in the habit of living according to Vinaya, then, I mean, it's just not really a big deal anymore, because it becomes like habitual, and it's just a convenient way of living your life in a relatively simple and blameless way. So there are no such thing as rules, there are only spiritual practices. Well, yeah, following the rules can be a spiritual practice if it's done wisely or with correct mental states. But following the rules, or having rules of a monastic discipline, like the story in the text implies, it adds stability to the system and keeps it from just dissipating in chaos. You have to have some kind of structure in order for something to continue to exist for an extended period of time. So, why monks fetishize about rules is they don't have anything else to do. Well, I can tell you that is false based on my own experience, because I was a monk who followed the rules. I don't know if I fetishized them or not, but I was very strict with following them. Up until like the last few years in America, where things started falling apart in a sense. We're going downhill, we're just, becoming more liberal. So, let's see. Oh, also, just having these rules, in a way, it's kind of a filter, where you've got someone who is really not worthy of living a dharmic life, crude lower types who can't live without vice. Then, I mean, that filters them out immediately, having these rules. So that's a fairly obvious and immediate advantage of having these rules. It filters out people that are already addicted to vice, or are so addicted that they can't not break rules or whatever. Although there are quite a few sloppy, unconscientious monks in the Sangha, especially Asian ones, sorry to say, just because they're following their tradition rather than breaking with their tradition in order to become a monk. So Western monks tend to be stricter on average than Asian monks, or at least Asian monks who were born and raised into a Buddhist culture, because Western monks they have to have a stronger resolve to leave behind, sometimes their family and their friends and just their whole way of life in order to become a member of the Sangha. But that wasn't even really a question, so I'll just move on to the next real question, which is from Baba AUI. And Baba AUI says, a question, can you describe the Taungpulu meditation method and how it differs from the Mahasi method? Thanks. The Taungpulu meditation method was similar to the Mahasi method, at least in the sense that they were both based primarily on satipatthana, just mindfulness. Although Taungpulu is a little bit different. He was certainly less of a scholar than Mahasi was. He was more of a forest ascetic, and so there were certain emphases like on Dukkha or like ascetic practices that are not found in the Mahasi tradition. Like spending the night in cemeteries and so forth is a common thing in the Taungpulu tradition, but not in the Mahasi method. The Mahasi method, for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of, why Mahasi Sayadaw decided to leave behind Anapana and instead emphasize the rising and falling of the abdomen while breathing. I don't know, but the Taungpulu meditation method still, it favors Anapana, or the touch of air at the nostrils. So that's one difference. Also, the standard method for Taungpulu, like beginners would be given this as their satipatthana method, is sitting, hearing, touching, sitting, hearing, touching. So it's like you're aware of the sitting posture, and then you become it's like you change your emphasis to hearing, and then you change your emphasis to any kind of sensation of touch, and you just go through this cycle, sitting, hearing, touching, until you come across one that is just stable. It's the one you're best at, and then you just go with that. It can be sitting, hearing, or touching, or if you're doing walking meditation, seeing is also an option. And I've been told that one reason why hearing is a big deal in the Taungpulu method is that at night, Taungpulu Sayadaw would be out in the forest meditating, and there'd be crickets and other like owls and so forth. That there's this constant kind of noise going on at night in Burmese forests, and it was just a very obvious object of meditation, just hearing. And I did a lot of that also when I was in Burma. Sitting I didn't like very much because sitting is not an ultimate reality according to Abhidhamma, according to Buddhist philosophy. Hearing is Vedana, which is an ultimate reality, at least according to Theravada. But sitting is just a concept. There is no ultimate reality of sitting. Touching also is an ultimate reality. That also is Vedana, or feeling. That can be just like raw data, whereas sitting is not raw data. That is like a concept. Also, the Taungpulu method did put some emphasis on the 32 parts of the body meditation, although it deviates from orthodoxy to some degree because it was almost like a kind of mantra. You just be repeating the different parts of the body, Kita, Loma, Nakat, Dandat, so over and over again. And supposedly insight was supposed to arise just from repeating the names without even like visualizing the body parts and so forth, which is kind of strange. I never saw the point of doing 32 parts of the body meditation without actually having some concept of the parts, the body parts that you're enumerating or listing off while you're meditating. Like I already mentioned, there are cemetery contemplations in Taungpulu method, and also a small amount of kasina meditation. Like Taungpulu Sayadaw was what's the word I'm trying to think of? Proficient enough in kasina meditation that he could teach others. In fact, my teacher originally went to Taungpulu Sayadaw because he wanted to learn kasina meditation. And Taungpulu Sayadaw was one of the few monks in Burma, or at least in that part of Burma, who could teach kasina meditation. And kasina meditation is a kind of hypnotic method of samatha, where as a general rule, usually you're focusing on just a colored disc and meditating on that. And there's more asceticism, more austerity, more dhutanga in the Taungpulu method. So I guess that those would be like the main differences, although ultimately they are based on satipatthana, both of them. Mainly based on satipatthana. The Mahasi method has way more emphasis on the book learning parts of it, and Abhidhamma making everything like what is called nyanzin, or the standard list of the Vipassana insight knowledges that you have to experience in order to make like real progress. And in the Taungpulu method, there's really very little emphasis on nyanzin, or the sequence of Vipassana insight knowledges. So that would be some of the main differences. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. Because as I say, we've got lots of questions today. This is a 2-week version. I skipped a week because I was sick. So this is from Sanguine Ultima, and Sanguine Ultima says, how can I overcome my attachment or aversion complex to the fairer sex? I experience a powerful obsession with beautiful women, yet I am overcome with crippling anxiety and self-conscious thoughts, merely seeing them in a common area. Well, I can sympathize with this because when I was a kid, I felt the same way. If there was a girl that I was sweet on, like I had a crush on some girl in school, I mean, this is true all the way up into high school. I mean, I would just almost have a panic attack if I was confronted with it. Then I'd be expected to like say something clever or witty or charming, and I would just freeze up and act like an idiot. And in my case, it's just a case of maturity. As you get more self-confidence and you realize that women are at least as messed up as guys are. It's not like they're some sort of angelic being or goddess or something. I mean, they might be pretty, but still, I mean, they've got their own issues, and as you get older and you get more of an understanding of yourself and more self-confidence, then that just kind of fades out, or at least it did in my case. So I don't know how old Sanguine Ultimate is. I mean, if you're in your 40s, then my heart goes out to you. But if you're, in your 20s, then at least you have, the ripening of maturity, the growth of wisdom and so forth that will help to cause this strange, crippling anxiety and self-conscious thoughts to become less and less as you grow in maturity. But again, if you're in your 40s or 50s, then I don't know, maybe some kind of therapy or something, or just meditate a lot. I think that's a good panacea for just about anything. Meditate a lot, and the required insight may arise to help you to overcome this. But I can sympathize with this, because I've gone through the same sort of thing when I was a kid in school. It finally started fading out when I got into college. So I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Indian guy, who I believe also goes by the alias of Trevor. An Indian guy says, do we know who it was who came up or founded the sub-reality of samsara? Like, I'm not sure I understand this question. Who was it that invented samsara? Is that it? I mean, samsara has always existed. There is no founder of it. There is no inventor of samsara. With regard to the concept of samsara, that's different. And it might be that, the concept of samsara was invented by some prehistoric philosopher in the Indus Valley civilization. But I'm not sure. Yeah, there might be a first person who came up with the idea of samsara. Just logically, there'd have to be a first person who came up with the concept of it. But with regard to samsara itself, it is beginningless and presumably endless. So nobody founded samsara. So I'll just move on to the next question here. Regardless of whether I actually answered that question or not, what changed about you during the first 5 years of being a monastic? Well, I got a lot skinnier. I was very strict, so I was much more serious. My first 5 years of being a monastic, I went through this. My teacher of monastic discipline, Venerable U Tejaniya, who is not the famous U Tejaniya in Rangoon, but just a Taungpulu, disciple of Taungpulu Sayadaw. U Tejaniya, because J is pronounced like a Z in Burmese. He's taught me that telling a joke was against Vinaya. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that only certain kinds of jokes are against Vinaya. And some of you may know that I'm got kind of a sense of humor. I am a maker of jokes occasionally. And so I just became very stern. It's like telling jokes is against the rules, so I didn't tell jokes. Also, he made the mistake of telling me that that looking at a woman with attraction or desire, or just looking at a woman the way a guy checks out a woman, is against Vinaya. And I asked him, well, what if you just noticed that she's pretty? And he said, yep, that counts. So it's like, oh great, I can't even look at a woman and notice that she's pretty. So for the first few years of my being a monk, I would just take a quick glance at a woman just to see who I'm talking to, and then just like stare at the floor, or at most like look at her foot. Some women have pretty feet though, so there was that too. So I was very like uptight when I was a junior monk, because I had this glorious ideal I'm trying to live up to, and just trying to live up to an ideal in general puts a person under considerable strain at times. See, what else changed about me in the first 5 years of being monastic? That's pretty much it. I was kind of sullen. I was disillusioned. That was another one. It was like, I've mentioned this before, that before I became a monk, I was naive, and I just assumed that by becoming a monk, I was going to be entering the brotherhood of men who are diligently striving for enlightenment, and all of them would be more advanced and wiser than me because all of them would have been striving longer than me. And then I ordained into this tradition and realized that most monks really, they just want to live an easy life. They want to live a quiet, easy life, and they're not striving for much of anything, really. So I was sullen because of that for the first few years, until finally I got to Burma. After I'd been a monk for about 2 years, I wound up in Burma, where I could just go off into a cave and meditate and not have to worry about dealing with monks that I did not approve of, because that was another effect of being a junior monk and a strictly practicing one, is it's so easy to just start despising monks who are just essentially shameless. And that's not good. Even if they are really shameless, you're better off, just minding your own business. Sometimes you can't completely mind your own business. You might have to take a stand or speak up or something. But still, if you're going to be just fuming over the monks handling money, or the monks raising chickens in their backyard and that kind of thing, then especially in a place like Burma, it's just going to completely derail you, because it's all around you. Most monks in Burma, or in Buddhist Asia for that matter, most of them are really not spiritually inclined. They do not have a true vocation. They've got other reasons for being a monk. Like I said, it might be they just want to live an easy life. So, there was a lot of changes that took place my first 5 years of being a monastic. Just the way of life, shaving my head, wearing different clothes, that kind of thing. But those were some of the main ones. So I'll just move on to Indian Guy's next question. What are some habits you still have from your monastic discipline? Well, a lot of mindfulness still, it's just spontaneous. It's a matter of habit. Certain mental states arise, you just see them arising and you don't take them as seriously. A few weird habits I've still got, like if I'm at a restaurant or even at home sometimes, and a waitress or my sweetheart is setting a plate of food down in front of me, I'll reach out and touch it so that it's offered properly. Or else I'll just have the urge to reach out and touch it until I realize, oh wait, I don't have to do that anymore. But like as a monk, if I'm sitting in a restaurant and the waitress is putting something down, I have to very quickly and kind of subtly put my finger on it before she lets go of it, because it has to actually pass from one hand to the monk's hand in order for it to be properly offered. So yeah, that's still sort of a lingering urge that still exists. The main one is just like basic mindfulness. Not that I'm like a master of it all the time, but still it's still there. Like this habit of 30 years has left its mark. And so I'm more mindful now than I was before I became a monk. See, what other habits do I still have from my monastic discipline? Those are pretty much it, I think. Yeah, I can't think of any more offhand. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Ruhe. And Ruhe says, hello, Panyo, did you ever have trouble conveying the importance of the First Noble Truth to people? Probably not. Maybe a little bit, but I've never really been a kind of person to hammer away at the First Noble Truth. That it seemed way more important to me to hammer away at the Second Noble Truth, because that's more important for people to realize. To realize that, to exist is to suffer, in a way that's kind of a truism. There might be some people who resist that and think that all they got to do is just set up things really nice and get the right house and the right mate and the right dog and the right car, and they'll just be blissfully happy with no unhappiness. But those kind of people are just naive to the point of silliness, because, there's always going to be shit happening. So the Second Noble Truth is way more important to convey to people, which is whenever you are unhappy, it's because you are desiring something. That's really, I've said it, I think it was even the previous Q&A, I was saying that if you know only one thing about Buddhism, if you know only one thing about Dhamma, It should be that whenever you're unhappy, it's because you desire something. And that desire is ultimately a choice. You don't have to desire it. So suffering is voluntary and self-inflicted, ultimately. Although most people don't realize it. So in a way, it's not voluntary, even though it's still self-inflicted. They don't even know that there's an option, and so they're just kind of stuck. And that's most people on this planet. So that's one reason why it's so important to convey the idea. Not so much that you're going to suffer in this life, because that's just kind of a downer. There's, it's just kind of a buzzkill. But to tell them, why it is that they suffer, that's way more important to me. So, and you tell people, and even though they might be like devout Buddhists, still, it's just a lot of times it's just over the head. They're so locked in to a habitual way of dealing with things that it just doesn't really fit into their habitual way of dealing with things. And so they might say, "Yes, sir, that's true, sir," and then they just let it go and continue ignoring it. So that can be a little bit frustrating, but you shouldn't really be, depending on other people understanding what you're telling them. And that goes for this Q&A also. If you don't get it, that's just tough. So I'll just go on to the next question here. This is also from Ruhe. What are your thoughts on using the recollection that, quote, the mind is the forerunner, unquote, as a practical foundation conducive to clearly seeing the sensual domain and advance towards first jhana? I'm not sure if it would have any real effect on me. Let's say you're a philosophical idealist. The world that you're navigating through is essentially the same world as the world that a materialist is navigating through, except for some few concepts. When you're not philosophizing, it's essentially the same, and that's most of the time, isn't it? So the mind is the forerunner as a practical foundation conducive to clearly seeing the sensual domain. To understand kama is a mental state, karma is a mental state, and to realize that karma is conditioning your reality, that is important, and it can help you to understand the sensual domain better. And whether it would help you to advance towards first jhana or not is different. I think that would be largely irrelevant. I don't see that there's necessarily like a statistically significant correlation between understanding that the mind is the forerunner and attaining first jhana. It might be, but it's not like readily obvious to me. But understanding that, the world we live in is a product of our own mind. It's a construct of our own mind. Definitely gives you some insight into how the world works. If you see it as just a kind of a dream that you are dreaming, and that it's your karma lands you right where you need to be, and that's it's presenting you with the problems you need to face because you haven't learned to deal with them effectively yet. You continually having to face two things: the things that you have the most attraction for and the things you have the most aversion for, because that's where the karma is the strongest. So again, I'm not so sure that I answered this question. It is kind of a strange question. I haven't really thought about it much. It's not really what I have been focusing on as when I was a monk or now. The mind is the forerunner, or essentially, kama is a mental state, and that is, the fruition of our kama is this world. That I have accepted for a long time. And I don't know, in a way it kind of can help you to detach from samsara more easily if you realize that it's a kind of dream, or like the Matrix or whatever. So it can help you to detach from it more easily, although it's still, all the details are essentially the same as if we were scientific materialists, at least with regard to what we see and hear and so forth. So those are my thoughts on it, which might not be very deep thoughts on it because I haven't really thought about it much. at least not in the way that it is framed in this question. So I think I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Om, who is now known as Al Pacino Alpaca. He changed his name kind of in midstream here. So anyways, he who was formerly called Om says, the Buddha in some suttas said that everything is dukkha. In others, he says not getting what you want is dukkha and getting what you don't want is dukkha. Does that mean that getting what you want and not getting what you don't want? Oh, and now there's somebody texting me constantly. Okay, let's start this question over again. The Buddha in some suttas said that everything is dukkha. In other, he says not getting what you want is dukkha and getting what you don't want is dukkha. Does that mean that getting what you want and not getting what you don't want is not dukkha? No, it doesn't mean that. It's just, I mean, everything is dukkha in that, nothing in this perceptible world has the ability to completely satisfy us. At the very least, we're never going to be completely satisfied. There's always going to be this underlying subliminal restless dissatisfaction driving us through life. And that's going to happen whether you get what you want or you don't get what you want. It's just going to be more obvious when you don't get what you want. So when he's giving the list of, birth is suffering and sickness is suffering, and getting what you want is suffering, getting what you don't want is suffering, not getting what you want is suffering, being separated from what you love is suffering, getting old is suffering, getting sick is suffering, death is suffering. Those are just obvious examples of things that everybody has to face, pretty much. So, but even so, everything is dukkha. Everything in the phenomenal world, every sankhara, every conditioned thing is conducive to unhappiness because it is not conducive to total satisfaction, and that subliminal, at least restless dissatisfaction is always going to be there, because that's what's driving us through samsara. It's what's fueling us through samsara. It's in some of the early suttas, it's talking about the spike in our heart that just causes us to run in all directions, and that's it. That's unenlightenment, or delusion. Ignorance is causing us to just have this restless dissatisfaction, wanting something all the time, and that is what we have to cure ourselves from. In addition to this virus thing that I'm happy to say that I am getting better finally. So I'll just move on to he who was formerly known as Om's next question. And why somebody is texting me every 15 seconds, I don't know. All of a sudden, I've actually had to abort videos. Like I start doing a Q&A and all of a sudden somebody is like texting me again and again and again and again until finally I actually cuss or something and have to get up and move the phone into a different room and come back and just start the whole Q&A over again. So, he who was formerly known as Om now says in this next question here, in your state, are you allowed to get married everywhere, like at a lake or mountain or wherever, or do you have to do that in like city hall or court? No, I mean, as a Buddhist layperson, you can get married at a lake or a park or a mountain or whatever. Buddhist temple, if it's not a Theravada Buddhist temple especially, you can just find some old hippie shaman Buddhist priest to marry you or something. So, yeah, I mean, marriage in Buddhism is a secular affair. It really, Theravada Buddhism has really no rules about marriage because it has nothing to do with what Buddhism is all about, like I've mentioned before, that it's a relatively serious offense for a Buddhist monk to participate in a wedding ceremony. That he would have to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights. It's like the most serious offense that a monk can commit without actually being excommunicated. So, yeah, so I can get married however I want to get married, so long as my sweetheart agrees, and because. I mean, she ought to agree because she's going to be there too. So we'll just move on to the next question here. This is from RPAD. And RPAD says, why did the Buddha have his monks shave their heads and beards while he kept his own hair as per traditional depictions? And why not his beard then? I'm not sure about the beard part, but yeah, it's the Buddha did shave his head. I mean, he's mentioned as having a shaved head many times in the suttas. In fact, there are some like uppity Brahmins, some sort of bigoted, prejudiced Brahmins in the text who refer to him as like a skinhead, because the Brahmin renunciants were jatilas as a general rule. They had like dreadlocks, they were matted hair ascetics, and so the ones with the shaved heads were non-Vedic and to be disapproved of, and they'd see the Buddha and they would immediately disapprove because he had a shaved head. And so the whole idea of why the Buddha has hair on his head, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the previous Q&A, where the first people to make Buddha statues were Greeks who lived in like northwestern India, because Alexander the Great conquered northwestern India and planted Greek colonies there, and there were already some Greek colonies in the general area of Bactria, which is now like Pakistan and Afghanistan, because uppity Greeks in the Persian Empire, there were Greeks who were subjects to Persia. They would be like, if they refused to hand over a political criminal demanded by the king, they would just get scooped up by the Persian army and relocated, like banished way the hell over on the other side of Persia where they couldn't make as much trouble. So when Alexander the Great conquered that area, he found there were already Greeks living there. And anyways, a lot of those Greeks converted Buddhism and they started making statues, because the Greeks made statues long before the Indians did. And so they based the Buddha on the god Apollo, who had head hair. And that's why the Buddha statues to this day still have that weird knob on top, because that was a kind of aristocratic top knot that the god Apollo had, according to this theory, that just became like this weird vestigial lump that nobody could really understand, because the whole idea of a top knot of hair had faded away into oblivion. But the god Apollo didn't have a beard, apparently, so they never started putting beards on the Buddha statues. So sometimes even the monks will have a little bit of head hair. It'll be just like stubble. It'll just be dark on top to indicate that they've got, a week's growth of head hair up there. Although even then they usually don't have facial hair, because like in a Buddhist country like Thailand or Burma especially, men just don't have a whole lot of facial hair. A lot of monks in Burma don't bother to shave their face. What few hairs they get, they just got like these tweezer things and they pluck them out, which technically is against the rules, but it's really not that big of a deal. So that's why the Buddha had his monks shave their heads and beards. It was a symbolic way of cutting oneself off from society. I mean, it was a way of cutting off one's social status. Because I have read that in the Buddhist time, if a higher class person, especially a Brahmin, you could tell what clan they came from just from the arrangement of like braids and stuff in their hair and beard. It was sort of like a Scottish tartan. You can tell what clan it is just from the pattern of the plaid on their kilt. It was sort of that way among ancient high caste people in the Ganges Valley. Just you could tell by the way they had their hair what their social status was, what clan they came from. And so in a way, shaving your head and beard was just cutting off your social status. It was a symbolic act of renouncing society. And the Buddha did it too, but because the Greeks started making Buddha statues with head hair, because he was based on Apollo, who had head hair traditionally in statues, that they just started putting head hair on him to help kind of explain. He retained the head hair to explain this weird lump on top, probably, which used to be a top knot on the god Apollo. So, there are pictures. I used to like tease Burmese monks who would have like some calendar picture on the wall of their hut, and it would be like the Buddha's renunciation, where he'd have his sword. He'd be out in the woods with the sword, cutting off his long hair with his sword, but he'd still like have this baby smooth face. From him, he had no facial hair whatsoever. And I'd say, you know, the Buddha, he was an Indian. He was Kala. He wasn't Burmese. He probably had a relatively thick beard and mustache too. So he should have been cutting that off with his sword too. And I remember one monk, he sort of grinned and had to admit that I was right. And then he took a pen and was drawing facial hair onto Prince Siddhartha as he's sitting on the rock or whatever, cutting his hair with his sword. So anyway, I think let's move on to RPAD's next question here, which is as follows. How can one say, I was such and such in a previous existence, since there is no such thing as the self? Isn't it in this sense that aggregates are dissolved, then recomposed with others and reborn, instead of an individual soul going from incarnation to incarnation? Yeah, there is no individual soul going from incarnation to incarnation unless that soul is just not ultimately real. And that is an idea that I had a long time ago as a monk. It's like people usually, like in the West, they believe that they've got an individual self, and at least religious people generally believe that they also have a soul. In Buddhism, it says there is no self, there is no soul, but they admit, well, obviously we kind of have a self, you know, it's at least in a conventional sense, but they never go so far as to say, well, we might also have a soul in a conventional sense. And it could be that just as we have an individual, you know, body and mind in a conventional self, even though it's not ultimately real and distinct, it might be the same way with regard to some, you know, higher dimension of ourselves, you know, 4-dimensional version of ourselves or 5-dimensional version of ourselves. I mean, they could be considered to be a kind of soul, but even that soul is not ultimately real. It is just conventionally real. It's part of this mind-generated multiplicity. But getting back to this question here, how can one say I was such and such in a previous existence, since there is no such thing as a self? Well, I mean, in the conventional sense, there is. And when you say I was such and such in a previous existence, you're still dealing at the conventional level, and you just be dealing with like the karmic momentum that is like generating you now, but was generating somebody else previous to you. And so you can say, well, I was that person. And it may be that there's even, I mean, there are some people who claim to remember that, including my own father. He claimed to remember a number of his previous existences. So it's like the same illusion that causes us to believe that we exist as an individual person, that causes us to believe that, you know, we've got like this entity that survives from one life to the next. And in a conventional sense, that's valid. I mean, it's empirical. Maybe not rebirth would satisfy an empirical scientist. Most scientists probably don't believe in that. But still, to the individual person, it's empirical if they can at least, you know, seem to remember a previous life, especially if they got some kind of evidence to help back it up. But let's see, isn't it in this sense that aggregates are dissolved, then recomposed with others and reborn, instead of an individual soul going from incarnation to incarnation? What goes from incarnation to incarnation is karma. It's the momentum of your mental states. You know, it's the psychic momentum that drives you forward from one life to the next, and even from one moment to the next. So that would be like the Buddhist equivalent of a soul, at least from the orthodox point of view, would just be the momentum of your own karmic stream. So in a way, it would be untrue or invalid to say that it's like a distinct entity, just like it would be invalid to say that a river is a distinct entity, because it's just this stream of water, and it's different water, you know, going through it all the time. You know, from one moment to the next, it's not the same. Or a flame, you know, from one moment to the next, that flame is completely different. But you say it's the same flame as a matter of convenience. And so it's the same way with a person. from one moment to the next or from one life to the next. It's the same stream. It's not the same from one moment to the next, but still you can, just as a matter of convention, you say it's the same. And I'm going to look and make sure that we're recording. That's good. Maybe I should have checked that like 2 hours ago, but it looks like we're good. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is from Jules. And Jules says, do you have any personal favorite misogynistic passages from the Pali Canon? And I personally am not a misogynist. At least, probably some feminists would claim that I am one, just because of some of my perceptions of femininity and so forth. But I am not misogynistic. I am quite happy that there is such a thing as sexual dimorphism in the human species. And so I really don't have a favorite misogynistic passage from the Pali Canon, although the first passage that comes to mind that would pass for misogynistic is like the first verse of the Magandiya Sutta, where the Buddha is, according to the story, referring to this beautiful young woman, and he's saying, "What is this full of urine and dung? I would not want to touch it even with my foot." So, I can't say that it's exactly my favorite, because I don't really have a favorite, but it's the first one that came to mind. Also, there are a few verses passages in Vinaya about this woman who's trying to seduce, I think it's Mahakassapa, who was the most ascetic of all the Buddha's disciples. And she's just doing everything. She's like taking her clothes off and posing, and then just like lying down in front of him and spreading her legs and everything. And he just kind of glances at her and walks away. He doesn't even respond. So in a way, I guess that might be misogynistic. It was kind of funny when I was reading it, though. So something like that maybe, but I really don't have a personal favorite misogynistic passage from the Pali Canon, at least none that come to mind. Although, maybe you could say like the whole scene where the Buddha's stepmother and aunt, because she was the same person, Mahapajapati Gautami, is wanting to be the first ordained nun, and the Buddha just, nope, not gonna do it. And so she's like following him around, crying with like dust in her hair, standing outside his doorway in tears with like dirt on her face and stuff. And finally, the Buddha's cousin, Ananda, whose family name was also Gautama, talks the Buddha into ordaining nuns. And then the Buddha said, all right, but now you've done it, because Buddhism is only going to last half as long now. So maybe you could call that a kind of favorite misogynistic passage in the Pali texts. But really, I'm not a misogynist. I don't consider myself to be one anyway. And I don't have a favorite misogynistic passage. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Pete says, what makes something a stupa in Theravada Buddhism? Are relics or a monk's blessing required? Well, it's kind of an interesting question. I never really thought about it much. Originally a stupa was a burial mound for a saint, which derives from kurgans, which were prehistoric, proto-Indo-Aryan burial mounds for chieftains that still exist in Central Asia and probably southeastern Europe. So, like Russia and Ukraine, that general area, there might still be some prehistoric burial mounds of Indo-Aryan or Indo-European chieftains back then, or proto-Indo-European chieftains. But what makes something a stupa in Theravada Buddhism? First of all, there's in Burma especially, there's a difference between a stupa and a pagoda. And it's not obvious which it is, because at the monastery where I was ordained in California, they had a stupa and a pagoda. One was called a pagoda, the other one was called a stupa. And the stupa enshrines some of Taungpulu Sayadaw's ashes. So presumably a stupa should contain at least some relics of some Buddhist saint, or someone considered to be a Buddhist saint. So yeah, I think that would make it an authentic stupa instead of just some kind of shrine or pagoda. Because, at least in Burma, stupas and pagodas are shaped the same. In fact, they can be the same thing. Like the Shwedagon, which is one of the most well-known pagodas in Burma. It's in like downtown Rangoon. Which is beautiful, by the way. Anyone goes to downtown Rangoon, they should check it out. In a way, it's a pagoda and a stupa because it supposedly contains relics from 4 different Buddhas, including a few hairs from the head of our Gautama Buddha. Although they couldn't have been very long hairs because, as I was saying earlier, he shaved his head. So, I don't know about a monk's blessing. I assume they would automatically be blessed because after you make a pagoda, then they're kind of consecrated. They put the tea on, which is, the tea literally means the umbrella. It's like this metal things, often with like gems or fake gems on it, gold or gold plate or at least brass, and it might have like little jingle bell things that tinkle in the wind hanging from the bottom of that. And they place that on with this ceremony where that's like the consecration day of that pagoda. And then as a general rule, every year on that day there's a pagoda festival. And I assume a stupa, I think by definition, I never really thought about this much, but I think pretty much by definition a stupa would have to contain the relics of some perceived Buddhist saint. Or possibly some saintly king. Well, I guess he'd have to be a Buddhist king, wouldn't he? Maybe just a good king. So, I guess I answered that one. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Lieberlam. And Lieberlam says, have you had a hypnotic regression? Well, I'm pretty much immune to hypnosis, which is one reason why I've been pretty much immune to certain samatha meditation methods like are taught in the Pa-Aut method. And I was told by my father, who was an amateur hypnotist, that when I was like 5 years old, he hypnotized me, which for him was a sign that I was advanced as a child, because you have to have a certain mental age of like 9 or something, or 7 or something like that, before you can be really hypnotized, at least according to him. So he hypnotized me when I was a little kid to make me think that my big toe was growing. I don't remember it. That's what he used to say. In recent times, after I became an adult, there were a few attempts at hypnotizing me, and at best, I just got into kind of a dreamy state. But I never was really hypnotized. At least I don't think I was really hypnotized. It was just sort of like a very mildly kind of dreamy state. But I didn't go into a deep trance or anything. So I'll just move on to Lieberlam's next question here. In the sense that there is no self-willing, do you feel that man should, in a sense, discard the flesh and take up the spirit, such that one can't rightly invoke the circumstances of their flesh, experiences, causes they uphold, etc., in defense of their sovereignty or right against the greater might of an unobserved natural order? And this is getting more into the standard Lieberlam kind of question. The guy is so intellectual in his wordage that sometimes it's hard to understand exactly what he's saying. So let's see. In the sense that there is no self-willing, ultimately, do you feel that man should, in a sense, discard the flesh and take up the spirit? But at the same level that there is ultimately no self-willing, there'd be no spirit either, really. At least no individual spirit, such that one can't rightly invoke the circumstances of their flesh, and then he's got experiences, causes they uphold, etc., in defense of their sovereignty or right against the greater might of an unobserved natural order. Man, Lieberlam's good at this. He asks questions that I'm sure make perfect sense to him. He can see the meaning of this with crystal clarity. But for me, it's almost like it's like some kind of I don't know, like an utterance of the Pythoness at Delphi. So let's see. Like I already said, that at the level that there is no self-willing, there's also no individual spirit either. So that kind of takes care of most of the question, I think. but then he's got such that one can't rightly invoke the circumstances of the flesh. I mean, if you do deny the existence of physical flesh, then you would have to admit that what appears to be physical flesh is actually spirit or mind. So in a way, you're just converting the circumstances of your flesh from a physical circumstance into a mental circumstance, which is still a circumstance at the worldly level. And what the defense of our sovereignty or right against the greater might of an unobserved natural order, that's a tricky one. The defense of our sovereignty or right against the natural might of an unobserved natural order. Well, in order to have sovereignty, you'd have to have a real self, I think. So you'd still be living at, this would still be at the level of delusion. And what rights are, I remember there was one guy on our Discord server that was talking about natural rights, and he, in a way, kind of got dogpiled by me too. Not really, people like attacking him or anything, but just disagreeing with him to the point that, it's like, I really don't think that rights are natural. Rights are a kind of political construct. They don't exist in nature. What rights exist in nature? It's the law of the jungle in nature. If you're able to kill something, you can go ahead and kill it, for example. So our sovereignty or right against the greater might of an unobserved natural order. And I'm not sure what an unobserved natural order would be. What is an unobserved natural order? The observed natural order is just, laws of nature. Things fall down instead of up. We get older and older until we die, that kind of thing. But the unobserved natural order, the greater might of an unobserved natural order, I just do not fully understand that. So I'm sorry, Lieber Lamb. You've bested me again on this one. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know, if you could translate it into like normal English or something. But yeah, I don't get it. And I'm gonna have to blow my nose. I'm sorry. People who are grossed out by the sound of nose blowing had best put their fingers in their ears for the next 10 seconds. That was an ear popper. Okay. Oops. I dropped it on the floor. Where certain silly little dogs might grab a hold of it and start shredding it into confetti. Snotty confetti at that. So, the unobserved natural order, the greater might of an unobserved natural order. I'm not exactly sure what that would be. If it's unobserved, how do you even know that it's there? Just logical deduction? Yeah, I think Lieberlam's going to have to explain the question better, or explain it in order for me to be able to answer it better. So I'll just move on to Lieberlam's next question, which is refreshingly simple. Lieberlam's next question: what is the spiciest food you've ever eaten? See, it's so simple. It's just a simple sentence. An interrogative sentence, but a sentence nevertheless. What is the spiciest food you've ever eaten? And the first thing that came to mind is I was still a monk in California, at a Burmese monastery in California, just shortly after my ordination, and a Vietnamese family came and offered food. And I was sitting back in my cabin, back in the woods behind the monastery, eating this stuff. And I noticed that there were these little green peppers in this food. It was like some kind of curry. And these peppers were about this long. It was sort of like the same size and shape as the sharpened part of a pencil. And there's a dog snarfing loudly behind me now. Will you stop snarfing? Very snarfy dog. So anyways, these peppers were green, and they were about the same size and shape, kind of cone-shaped, as the sharpened end of a pencil. Once you get past the straight part where it starts to taper, it was about that size. And I remember, will you stop snarfing? And I remember taking a bite of this, and it was just immediately alarms start going off. And it's like my mind is racing, like should I take another bite and try to eat this, or should I spit it out now? And while I'm thinking this, just the reflex of my jaw just bit down on it again, and that was it. I just had to go just blah, and just spit it out. And then I drank like a quart of water, because it was the hottest pepper I had ever eaten in my life. And then I went in later and told the Burmese monks about it, and they're saying, oh, that explains why the temporary monk was doing what he was doing, because I assume he was having the same reaction that I was having. Man, I'd never bitten into a pepper that hot before in my life, anywhere close to it. I assume there's pepper connoisseurs that know, it's like the Carolina Reaper, you get, or the ghost pepper or whatever, you get this kind of it, and it's even hotter or something. But yeah, it was too hot for me. But with regard to food in general, aside from that bad experience with Vietnamese curry, the spiciest food in general that I've eaten is this stuff in Burma called ngapi, which is good. I used to like ngapi. And the hottest stuff is kind of a purple color, and I think it's made out of shrimp. And it's got like 3 main ingredients. It's got fermented shrimp, or other ngapi, it has fermented fish. It's like 1/3 fermented fish or shrimp, 1/3 salt, and 1/3 chili peppers. And you can't eat it by itself. I mean, you take a little piece of it, like the size of a pea, and you mix it in with some other kind of rice and curry and stuff, and then it's significantly spicy. But just eating it alone would just blow off any socks that you might happen to be wearing. But it's good. I like ngapi. I kind of miss it a little bit. And I probably wouldn't like it as much if I knew exactly how they make it, because I'm sure the process of fermenting the fish is gross, basically. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Stevens. And Stevens says, and I think Stevens might be joking here, can you realign my chakras? And no, I've never really practiced realigning chakras. I'm really not a chakra expert. Although I can say that before I came to South Carolina, when I was still a monk, at least I was still a novice at the time, still in robes. I was in Los Angeles. The only time I ever spent any time in Los Angeles, aside from the airport. And I happened to be brought to this guy who realigned chakras. And so he realigned my chakras a little bit. I mean, it was just like a short, casual, thing where he just kind of looked at me and waved his hands over me and stuff. It wasn't like the pro version. It probably cost money, but it was interesting that he said that my first chakra was just solid. I had just a Chad first chakra, but my second chakra, which is the sexual chakra, he said that there was like an imbalance, and that struck me as I didn't really get it at the time. Although having been a celibate monk for 30 years, it shouldn't have been too hard to figure out. And it turned out that he was more right than wrong, I think, with regard to his analysis of my chakras. But if you're ever in Los Angeles, just ask around. This guy who realigns chakras? And they'll probably lead you straight to him. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Crave Minerals. And Crave Minerals says, and I sincerely hope we're at least halfway through at this point, because we've been going at it for well over 2 hours now. Crave Minerals says, if someone gives a gift to a noble disciple without knowing they are such, would the merit still be abundant for the giver? And according to Orthodox Theravada, yes. Like, you offer alms to an arahant, even if you don't know that he's an arahant, you're pretty much going to heaven unless you do something to mess it up. Like, there is a story somewhere in the commentaries, I think, of some rich man who a Pacceka Buddha was going for alms, and this rich guy sees the Pacceka Buddha and he has some leftovers given to the Pacceka Buddha as alms. And then as the Pacceka Buddha is walking past, this rich guy who really wasn't very religious or anything was just thinking, oh man, that was kind of a waste. I could have just given it to the servants. And because he gave the food to the Pacceka Buddha, even though he had no idea the person was a Pacceka Buddha. He went to heaven for a zillion gajillion years, but because he regretted it afterwards, he also went to hell for a zillion gajillion years. I can't remember which came first, heaven or hell, but he had to go to both. So you have to be real careful in your attitudes towards people that might be saints. But in reality, I think it might not be that extreme, but I'm sure that if you give a gift to like a wise, holy person, it's going to yield more fruit than if you just give it to a homeless person on a street corner who might just take the money and buy meth with it. And it's partly because, people are connected. The mental states are contagious, and when you interact in a positive way with a wise person, it's going to cause positive results. And if you interact in a negative way, it could produce, sort of magnified negative results also. Like just sneering and insulting a saintly person is probably worse than sneering and insulting somebody who just ran over your dog or something on purpose, let's say. So, yeah, I think it would be abundant for the giver if you donate to a saint more so than if you donate to someone who is not a sage or a saint. What difference does it make whether you know that they're a saint or not? You can't really know that someone's a saint. You can believe that they're a saint. It's more a matter of faith, I think, than like empirical observation. So, yeah, I'm not sure if it would be significantly more karmic benefit from offering something to someone you think is a saint than someone who actually is a saint but you have no idea. And it might depend just on the individual, because really it's individual mental states that determine the value of the karma that is generated. So I think maybe I answered that question. So I'll just move on to Craig Mineral's next question, which is a follow-up to the first one. He says, reversely, if someone harms a noble disciple without knowing they're one, would the karmic repercussions still be very bad? I kind of lumped those two questions together. So yeah, I already answered that one, didn't I? Yeah. So yeah, I think I already answered that one. So I'll just move on to the next one from Craig Minerals here, which is, at first I thought I was silly to be scared of the possibility of going to a heaven realm. But when I imagined being surrounded by beauty, temptations all around, abundant pleasure for thousands and thousands of years, how can I know I would have the willpower to resist and get lost in it? I'm not sure. Kind of an impossible question, but how hard is it generally to remain a Buddhist in such a situation, do you think? I guess it's not hopeless if there's true Dhamma circulating in the heavens. And according to Theravada Buddhism, there are devout Buddhist small g gods and goddesses up there. It may be partly because it doesn't matter what it is, you get used to it. If you're exposed to the same thing for 1,000 years, eventually it's just going to become neutral. It's not going to be that big of a deal anymore. And then you might just get bored. Everything's so nice that you start looking for something better. Or, you start taking up Dhamma as a hobby or something. And that's the way a lot of people are, including the Buddha himself. According to the legend, he had it all. He was this royal prince who had a harem of beautiful dancing girls and lived had 3 different palaces, and everything was beautiful and wonderful. But still, he just realized that even when you have everything you want, it's still not satisfying. You get everything you desire, and still there's this latent, restless dissatisfaction that doesn't go away. And so then it's like an insight on the road to becoming a liberating insight. And a lot of Western Buddhists, they're like rich yuppies, or maybe not yuppies, rich boomers living in California, Marin County, that kind of a thing. They got it all. They're doing yoga on the beach and sipping the best wine and everything, and still there's just something that's not satisfying about it. So then they start looking for something more deeply satisfying, like Dhamma. And then they might continue with the yoga on the beach and the wine sipping and so forth, but at least they're meditating. So, heaven is nothing to be afraid of. Better heaven than hell. You just wind up where you need to be. So if you go to heaven, it's because your karma landed you there, and that's the appropriate place for you to be, and so you'd best deal with it as best as you can. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Stop Fear. And Stop Fear says, you may have been asked this before. If so, please direct me where I can listen to it. Well, I'll answer it right here. For the sake of convenience. Question is this: are you aware of Brian Ruhe's racist comments and racist behavior over the years? Do you endorse his far-right, alt-right views? Well, I know Brian fairly well, and I can't think of any racist comments that he has ever made or racist behavior he has ever made, other than, first of all, he does believe that the Hebrew race, that there are a lot of them, not even most of them, but a lot of them who are involved in this globalist cabal to control the world and do this and that. So, that might be racist. Also, he does not believe that the Holocaust was nearly as bad as, he's like a Hitler fanboy. And the thing is, he's a devout Buddhist at the same time. So it's not like he's condoning genocide. He's just flat out denying that Hitler did any such thing. So he just thinks that Hitler was this peace-loving hero of a man who was combating like globalism, and he lost and was demonized. And I don't go nearly as far as he does in that regard, although I do think that Hitler has been like propagandized and demonized to the point that if you were to make a poll of just random normies, you poll them, who is the evilest man who ever existed, probably Adolf Hitler would appear at the top of the list, even though Stalin killed more people than Hitler did, and Chairman Mao killed more people than Stalin and Hitler combined. And there have been some really evil people that were worse than Hitler, but just because of the propaganda machine, and Hitler really did attack the wrong folks apparently, that But Brian, in all sincerity, he has just this innocent belief that Hitler was a good guy. He just doesn't believe the standard narrative, because there's something about Brian that makes him averse to believing any established narrative. There always has to be this alternative, like a conspiracy or something, that he prefers. And it's just part of his psychological makeup that it's like he just assumes as a default setting that any established narrative is bound to be false. And there might actually be some wisdom in that. I certainly don't believe every established narrative, but I believe more than he does. So what actually constitutes his racist comments and racist behavior, unless it's certain aspects about certain members of God's chosen people? He's not a racist in general, other than maybe accepting that there are differences among races. And I accept that also, as just from a biological point of view, although that itself can be denounced as vile heresy. Racism by certain people on the left especially. But Brian's girlfriend is Chinese, so he's obviously not like a staunch white supremacist. And with regard to far right and alt-right views, I'm not exactly sure what Stop Fear here is referring to, unless it's just that Hitler supposedly was far right, although Hitler was not far right. He was, a lot of scholars would consider him to be a radical centrist, because the Nazi party, so-called, was a socialist party. At least it was called a socialist party, but the National Socialist German Workers' Party was the name of it. And it is true that Hitler really didn't care much about economics, and he was quite in favor of a certain amount of capitalism, but he didn't believe in parasitic capitalism. I can't remember the exact word that he used, of people that don't work for a living. They just they just pump money into something and then get most of the kickbacks or the profits. Yeah, he definitely didn't believe in that, which is probably more left-wing than right-wing. But I mean, I'm not aware of Brian Ruhe really having far-right, alt-right views, except in his belief that Hitler was not nearly as bad of a guy as like the mainstream narrative would have us believe. Aside from that, he is a devout Buddhist and a better person than most of the people who are freaking out on him, like on street corners. You know, he'll be standing on a street corner, this blissful martyr-like expression on his face, holding up a sign saying, you know, apologize to Adolf Hitler for 70 years of lies, or however many years it's been. And people will just be freaking out and just spitting on him, like trying to grab his sign away and tear it to pieces and so forth. Well, Brian, I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, he is obviously morally superior to the people who are freaking out at him. And so, I mean, even Stop Fear here is sort of making insinuations of a kind of moral superiority over Brian Ruhe, when, I mean, he has some weird ideas, but he is a sincere, devout Buddhist, and probably a better Buddhist than most of the Western Buddhists I have met. So that would be my answer to this one. Am I aware of his racist comments? I'm not sure what racist comments those would be. Unless, again, it's believing that there's a certain cabal of certain like wealthy globalist Hebrews. But they're certainly not all of them. And I guess they're somehow cooperating with some kind of space aliens or something, according to Brian. So he does have weird ideas, but I consider him to be a sincerely good guy and a better guy than most of the people who are bad-mouthing him in public. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, when speaking of spiritual matters in Buddhism, and since there is no spirit in Buddhism, what terms would be more appropriate than spirit? Well, I still think spiritual is fine. I mean, obviously the go-to in Buddhism would be Dhamma or Dharma, although a lot of normies wouldn't know what that meant, so you might as well just go back to spiritual or spirituality. To say that there is no spirit in Buddhism, I mean, it depends on what exactly you mean by spirit. I mean, mind can be called spirit, and there's certainly mind in Buddhism. So, and I mean, Buddhism is spiritual in that sense, and just it asserts, you know, that mind is the forerunner. Mind is, you know, essentially the most important thing that we got to deal with. So, I mean, if you want to be more appropriate than spirit, quote unquote, then Dharma or Dhamma. But I mean, there's really spiritual as an English word. I mean, it doesn't necessarily imply that there's any belief in an immortal soul. So yeah, I think that the word spiritual is fine. I use it myself. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, if we see Theravada on one hand, Pure Land on another, and maybe Western New Age Buddhism on another, Tibet, Zen, etc., how does one determine where authentic Buddhism stands? So if you want to know what is authentic or original, genuine Buddhism, you know, like what the Buddha actually taught, to some degree you have to do some detective work, which I have done quite a lot of, and quite a lot of people nowadays, including some respectable scholars, have been doing, where, I mean, you have to use a certain amount of deductive logic, I think. And so, I mean, one of the best ways is just determine what are the oldest texts, and so at least temporarily, you'll be getting closer to what the Buddha actually taught. Anything that, according to the historical evidence, that didn't even exist for 500 years after the Buddha's time, and then all of a sudden it's declared to be the highest teachings of Buddhism, then, yeah, I mean, you definitely have a certain amount of skepticism with regard to that, because there's no evidence that highest teachings of Buddha even existed for 500 years until, you know, after the Buddha died, and then somehow it arises into prominence. So you just find the oldest texts, and then using various techniques, you can tease out the oldest layers of those oldest texts, like the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, which is not orthodox Theravada. It's pre-Theravadan. And so, you use these methods to determine what are the oldest texts, and that would take you closer to what the Buddha actually taught. And then still you wouldn't be sure, but at least you would have like an educated guess as to what is the most authentic, original Buddhism. So read the Atthakavagga and see what that says. And I think most scholars would agree that the Atthakavagga is very old. It's one of the oldest layers of the Pali text, and the Pali canon is the oldest complete set of Buddhist scriptures that we have. So it goes back to ancient India and not like China or Tibet or anything. Buddhism arose in the Ganges Valley, and Theravada, of all the living traditions, is the only one that is based on the culture of the Ganges Valley where the Buddha lived. It's still in a language very similar to what the Buddha probably spoke. And so you start with that, and then you can tease out stuff that is unlikely, like obvious anachronisms, obvious fairy tale stories and so forth. And then just step by step, you get closer and closer to what is likely to have been original Buddhism. So, yeah, no bodhisattva vows, sorry to say, no pure land, no Avalokiteshvara. So, yeah, that's the method I use. That's the method that most people investigating this do use, unless they've already got like a preconceived idea that the Buddhism of their choice is the true Buddhism, and then they just try to find ways of justifying or rationalizing what they've already chosen. And that happens too. In the human species, it happens a lot. It's reverse reasoning. It just runs rampant, not only in politics, but also in religion and everything else. You start off with what you want to be the truth, and then you just find the most plausible excuse to justify that. And then if that falls through, you just immediately latch onto a different plausible excuse. So, okay, how does one determine where authentic Buddhism stands? Yeah, you have to use some detective work or rely on somebody else who has done the detective work. And you just want to go as far back as you can and find the oldest layers of the oldest Buddhist teachings, and that would take you closer to what the Buddha originally taught, as a general rule. So we'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Jaunty John. John spelled Jaun. Jaunty John. And Jaunty John says, I'm interested in question of decision-making in Buddhism. How can fully enlightened human with non-dual view really decide what to do after enlightenment, especially in Theravada where there is no bodhisattva vow? Chan Buddhist would say, chop wood, carry water, eat when hungry, sleep when tired. Of course, free will is a delusion, as is its opposite. But you still do one thing or the other thing. Chan emphasizes kind of spontaneous action according to circumstances, but still spontaneous actions based on your habits. Of course, enlightenment is also non-dual, so you cannot really talk about it, but still I'm sure you get what I'm trying to get at. Well, so essentially the question seems to be how an arahant would make decisions. And one of my favorite theories with regard to this is that excuse me. He would no longer be generating his own karma, so he would be acting in accordance with the karma of the people around him. And that's kind of what Ram Dass used to say was the case with Neem Karoli Baba, who's up on the altar there. That the better you got to know him, the more you realized there was nobody there. He was just like a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. And so they would just do what people would kind of expect an arahant to do based on their own karma. and that would be different for different people. And the Buddha and also Neem Karoli Baba act differently with different people, just presumably because different people have different karma. But still, I mean, if you just assume that an arahant is a human being, let's just assume for the sake of argument that human beings exist, then still, once you become enlightened, I mean, your body and just the workings of your brain are still human. And so you're still going to behave like a human, even though you're detached from that and not identified with it anymore. It's just nature taking its course. So I assume the enlightened being would behave in a way like that. That it's just nature taking its course, and in accordance with whatever conditioning is conditioning it, and they're just not identified with it. They're just detached from it, but still it's happening. Just nature taking its course. So that would be my answer to that. I hope I answered that question. I hope, because I'm moving on to the next question, and this next question is the last question. This is going to be less than 3 hours. This is even going to be the longest Q&A I've ever done. And I was kind of shooting for a record here. But let's just do it. The next question is from Monk Mysterio. And Monk Mysterio says, was Jesus a real person? So again, let's assume that there are such things as real persons. Let's just leave anatta alone and just assume for the sake of argument that some people really exist. So, do I think that Jesus really exists? Yeah, I think that he did. I think there's a good chance that some of the stories attributed to him were garbled versions of something that happened to somebody else. You know, maybe Jesus to some degree is confused with John the Baptist, who, according to my best understanding, was Jesus's teacher. And then Jesus became like one of the leading disciples at John the Baptist's like retreat center or camp in the wilderness. And then when John the Baptist was arrested and eventually beheaded, Jesus just became the leader of the group. So, yeah, I think Jesus was a real person, but I don't think that all the stories about him are necessarily true. I don't think that he was the only begotten son of God Almighty, for example. I don't even think that he was born in Bethlehem to a virgin. But just based on the information about him, like this complicated story about how they have to they obviously had to patch things up to make him born in Bethlehem when everyone knew he came from Nazareth in Galilee, that sort of thing. Also in the New Testament, there are people who claim to have met him in person, including James, who calls himself a brother of Jesus and is considered to have been a brother of Jesus. So, and then I think it was back in the 1970s, they might have actually found the ossuary of Jesus and his family. Back in those days, it was a tradition for Jews to be like entombed until all that was left was a skeleton, and then you take the skeleton and you put it into this thing called an ossuary, which is this little, smaller than a coffin, a kind of casket smaller than a coffin, and you put it in, if you had a family tomb, you put it in the family tomb, and they may have found the family tomb of Jesus's family because all the names fit. Although Jude was called the son of Jesus rather than the brother of Jesus, because Jesus apparently had a brother named Jude or Judah. So, I think that he was a historical personage, although to some degree his life, just like the Buddha's life, has been mythologized to some degree. For that matter, I think that Hercules and Achilles were probably like real people at one time, even though most of the details of their life may have been just mythologized or just conflated with other people. Like the cult of Hercules, which was a big deal in ancient times, whenever the Greeks would move to a different area, a lot of cases, if there was some hero who was deified there, they would just say that he was Hercules, and they would just conflate the two, and gradually Hercules got lots and lots of stories added to his life just from people that were similar to Hercules that other cultures were venerating. And to a lesser degree, I think that's possible with Jesus also. But I do think that there was a historical person named Jesus who lived in Nazareth, who became a spiritual teacher. He may have started off as a carpenter, but was, spiritually inclined. He hears about this man, John the Baptist, on the River Jordan, and he goes and becomes a disciple, and he's gifted spiritually. He may have had some kind of awakening experience when he's being baptized in the River Jordan, when the Spirit of the Lord is said to have descended upon him like a dove. And then, like I already said, John the Baptist gets arrested and executed, and Jesus becomes the new leader, and he's not satisfied by staying out on the River Jordan. He wants to go where the people are, and so he starts wandering around. He's got some kind of psychic powers, presumably. At least I think he probably was able to heal the sick in certain cases. Maybe he really could walk on water. Maybe he really did do a miracle of the loaves and fishes and so forth. Neem Karoli Baba supposedly has had a lot of the similar powers that he exercised, and Jesus naturally assumed, because he had these powers, that he must be God's chosen, he must be the Messiah. And his followers considered him to be the Messiah, and that's the main reason why Jesus was crucified, is as a political criminal, because the Romans really didn't give a shit if someone was claiming to be the descendant of some obscure deity. I mean, lots of Romans, like Julius Caesar himself, considered himself, or at least claimed himself, to be a descendant of the goddess Venus. So, I mean, the Romans were pretty much indifferent to that sort of thing, but somebody being declared king of the Jews, who were just this renegade people that were continually rebelling, I mean, they just couldn't put up with that. So he was a political criminal, and even according to the Gospel according to John, he had that sign on the cross saying "King of the Jews." I mean, that was the Romans' reason. He was a political criminal. He was a dissident. So yeah, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that somebody like that existed in real life. It would be more abnormal or unusual or unlikely if all of that was just made up about someone who never existed. So yeah, I do think that Jesus of Nazareth really existed, assuming that anybody really exists. And that's it. I answered all these questions, and my lungs held out, and I only had to blow my nose once. So I consider this a success. Success. So if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask them in the comments below. If you have access to my Subscribe Star channel, you can ask them there. If you have access to my Discord server, you can ask them there. And hit the like button if you liked this. If you didn't like it, then you don't have to hit any like button or dislike button. You can just sit there. And subscribe if you haven't already, if you find anything of value in this. And if there's anything you want to know about Buddhism or meditation or Burmese monasticism or anything that you consider me to possibly be knowledgeable about, then feel free to ask, and be happy. And now I'm going to try and turn this off like this.